The only problem was that I thought that the guy looked Hispanic, and the detective said many witnesses described him as black. I thought they might want to come out and try for samples or surveillance videos or something, but I didn't hear back from the detective.
Always surprised.
Obviously, my parents freaked out, got us knives, pepper spray, and put up signs. We learned another tenant had complained that same morning too. The stupid apartment wouldn't let us out of our lease, so we moved to a second-floor apartment right above our old unit. Anyways, on September 4th of 2006, they arrested Mark Godot. I think the detective didn't call me because they were days away from arresting him. When I saw his mugshot though, I was sick, but also kind of relieved. He was absolutely the guy outside of my window. To me, he looked like he could have been Hispanic. You can judge for yourself if you Google it. He's on death row in Arizona now. His wife tried to mount some campaign to show that the police were framing him for something. On a personal level, it certainly would make for an interesting coincidence if this poor innocent man who they framed was also whispering like a creep and tapping at my window. The other interesting thing about this story is that I had a really bad eating disorder at the time, and about 8 months after this happened, I got in a solid recovery. I never would have experienced how wonderful life could be if the slightest thing would have changed that morning in 2006. I can't think of something more scary than a serial killer tapping on your window. And that actually happened to me. In my town, there's a stretch of road down a valley along a river. It's a gorgeous drive, probably only 15 miles, until it dead ends at a nature centre where there are lots of trails to hike, and people spend a whole weekend out there camping, fishing and hunting. The cell service cuts off about halfway there, but I drive that road all the time. It's a good drive to take while my infant naps in the car, and my toddler loves to look for all sorts of wildlife along the way. There are a few houses along the way, mostly tucked up in the side of the mountain, hidden in the trees, but we usually pass a few people along the road out for a jog or walking the dog. One morning, the baby falls asleep in the car, so we take a drive to the nature centre and back, looking for a moose or an eagle or something. It's about 6 degrees. The roads are kind of icy, but they're not too bad. We get to the dead end and turn around and head back towards town, when, about a mile down the road, I see 2 people walking along the shoulder. It's not unusual. It is a pretty morning too, but as I get closer, one of them jumps out in the middle of the road, frantically waving me down. I slam on my brakes, but with her in the middle of the road, and it being a bit slick out, I damn near slide into her with my car. I finally get stopped. The way she flagged me down, I thought one of them maybe had gotten hurt or something, and with no cell service where we were, maybe they needed help. I crack my window and the 2 of them run up to my car. The guy hung back, behind my car, in my blind spot, which, I must admit, immediately made me a bit nervous. I couldn't get a good look at him, but it was red flag number 1. But the lady came up to the cracked window and said that their car had broken down and they needed a ride into town. But I hadn't passed a car parked along the road, so that was red flag number 2. I explained that I had my kids in the car, so I obviously had no room, and nor was I comfortable having strangers in my car with my kids there, which just made her mad. I offered to call a cab, or an Uber in fact, but she refused those, and then started trying to open my car door, which thankfully was still locked. The guy behind my car started yelling and cursing at me, so I just said sorry again and just drove off. as soon as I drove far enough to get a cell signal, I called the non-emergency police line to let them know about the stranded hitchhikers. It turns out the police were looking for them because one of the homeowners along that road had found them sleeping in his car. And apparently, they were trying to get back into town to disappear before the cops found them. But the cops did find them. I had kind of brushed it off. That is, until a week later watching the evening news. They were a featured story because they were a husband and wife, and he murdered her and then tried to frame it as if she had just tripped and fallen down the stairs. Knowing that piece of information now, there's no doubt in my mind that if I had let them into my car, or they had successfully forced their way in, he definitely would have killed me too, just for my car. My mum, she owns her own business and she works extremely hard. This means that she spends many late nights sitting on the living room floor with her work sprawled out all around her. One night, back in 2003, she had a typical routine going, sorting through paperwork and making piles. It was late, close to midnight on a Wednesday, so when the phone rang, she was a bit surprised. My dad worked third shift at a factory, so she assumed that it was him. When she answered the phone, there was no reply. Just lots of heavy breathing. Admittedly creeped out, she hung up and called my dad immediately. He told her that he hadn't called, and she just left it at that. Keep in mind, this was almost 15 years ago, and we lived in a small town with practically no crime. We never locked our doors even, and were never scared of dangerous people at all. But the phone calls, they just kept coming. Every night, multiple times at night. And the person on the other end, they actually started talking. He started by saying, "Hello, Diane. You're so beautiful. I'd love to meet you," and things quickly escalated into him going into graphic detail of how he wanted to rape and strangle her. Of course, she stopped answering the phone, and she informed the police too. But nothing was ever done, and the phone would just continue to ring. My parents weren't in the situation where my dad could stay home from work, and my mum truly believed that the calls were just empty threats, so things continued on. Until one night, he got brave. My mum was sitting on the floor in front of our huge mirrored cabinet with all her work around her when the phone rang. She ignored it, as usual. She was concentrating hard on a piece of paper in front of her, when a glimmer of light in the mirror caught her eye. She looked up to see a pair of glasses peering at her in the reflection. She spun around to face the front door, which her back had been turned to, and a man was standing there, staring at her. She said that they both just stared at each other for what felt like forever, until she saw the doorknob turn. She started screaming, and the man quickly just ran away. In light of the phone calls, my parents had started locking all the doors, which was totally a foreign concept to our household. My older brother, who was about 17 at the time, and was aware of the phone calls, came running down the stairs with a baseball bat, but the man was long gone at this point. When the police came, they scoured our property, and came across close to 200 cigarette butts right underneath our living room windows, hidden behind bushes. Apparently, he had been watching her for weeks. The police also happened to find a bike trail coming from the windows and going down the sidewalk. They took the cigarette butts and did some DNA testing on them, and they were able to match them to a convicted rapist who lived right down the street from us, Robert Ham was arrested while riding his bike. He went to prison for menacing and attempting to commit a crime. He had many priors, so we assumed that he would be locked away for quite some time. The reason I'm telling this story is because he was released from prison earlier this year. More than a few years ago, I was working at a burlesque entertainer in a gentleman's club, and was idly sitting at the end of the bar one night when a couple came in. It wasn't unusual. I had no contact with them and thought nothing of them being there. Until later. A few days after that night, the doorman handed me a piece of paper that had 2 names and phone numbers written on it. Laura and Richard. I was supposed to call one of them, so I called Laura, who told me that they'd been the couple who'd been at the bar the other night, and they'd noticed me, and thought that I'd be perfect for a part in a movie that Richard was producing. They also asked if I'd be up for a meeting, and of course I would. Who wouldn't? I was told that Richard would pick me up the next night at 7, and to wear something wild. 7 o'clock came the next evening, and I was ready in a white lace dress with ostrich feather trim when Richard showed up outside my building. So I went down, introduced myself, and got in the car. We agreed to go to a local bar I knew well for the meeting, but first we had to go back to his place so that he could pick up some contracts he'd forgotten. So off we went. He went into the house and came back out with a few manila envelopes and an open bottle of beer, a brand that I didn't drink. Plus, it's against the law to drink alcohol in a vehicle here, so I stuck the beer into the window well of his Jeep and we went to the bar. At the bar, he showed me what were supposedly scripts from this movie he was producing, and some contracts. And to be honest, it looked pretty legit. Richard was really nice too, and I was interested. I'd made some plans to go out later with my soon-to-be boyfriend, so I excused myself to go call him on the bar's payphone, and took my Corona that I'd ordered at the bar with me to the bank of the phones. As a dancer, I'd been taught by the other, older girls to never let your drink out of your sight. My boyfriend wanted to get going to the other club, so I went back to the table where Richard was and told him that I had to go. He didn't like that, and tried a few different things to get me to go to the movie set with him, saying that I could meet Mickey Rourke and check out the set. But all I really wanted to do was meet my boyfriend. So I declined, took Richard's card, and just left. After that, I never heard from Richard again. But a couple of months later, the police came around to the bar I was working at. They had 2 big books of mugshots and a stack of Polaroids with them, and they wanted to talk to all of us about a predator couple who had been setting up meetings with dancers by saying that they were in the film industry, and then drugging and raping them. They showed me the 2 mugshot books and asked if I saw anyone I recognized in the pictures, and I immediately identified Richard and Laura. They then showed me the Polaroids, which were trophy pictures of the couple in the act of attacking the poor drug girls, and asked if I knew any of the victims and where we might find them, in order for them to talk to the girls. I only knew a couple of the women in the photographs, but there were a lot that this had happened to, apparently. Richard and Laura, they were prosecuted eventually. He went to jail, but apparently she didn't, because she was from a wealthy family, and she also turned witness on him, allegedly. About 12 years after Richard was convicted, I saw in the newspaper that he was up for the possibility of parole. So I wrote a letter to the parole board telling this story and urging them not to let him back out, because he's a dangerous offender who should have to stay in prison for the entirety of his sentence. If if I had drank that open beer that he had handed to me in his Jeep on the way to that meeting, I wouldn't have made it, and would probably have ended up in the same stack of that Polaroids. Girls and guys, always keep your eye on your drinks. Have fun, but be careful out there, okay? This is an encounter from about 10 years ago, and it took place in Milwaukee Airport. I was 19, recently independent, discovering my identity. In doing so, I had found and developed a relationship on MySpace with a girl from North Carolina, and I was infatuated. We talked online, video chatted, texted, and called each other constantly for 6 months, until we finally figured out how to meet in person. She came to visit, and it was perfect. I was totally obsessed, and that was that. We're still together to this day, too. Then it came time for her to fly back to North Carolina. And here is where things started to go wrong. She had a flight to catch, and I was dragging my feet, trying to absorb every last moment and commit it to memory, as I didn't know how long it would be until I got to see her again. We boarded a city bus, bags in tow, and headed to the airport. The bus trip took longer than we anticipated, and when we reached the airport, it was 5 minutes until boarding. We ran to the luggage check-in, only to be told that, apparently, she had missed her flight. My lollygagging had made her miss her flight. Shit. A small part of me was secretly happy, but I had no idea what to do now. I didn't have a car or any money to get her another flight. However, the woman at the luggage counter found her another seat on a later flight. 8 hours later. Again, I had no car, and I was planning on riding the bus back home. We really couldn't leave the airport easily, so we looked for a spot to post up for a few hours. No problem. She had her laptop and some blankets and pillows meant to use in the flight. We could hang out for a little while longer, and I was actually looking forward to the additional time together. So, we set off in search of somewhere to sit down and stretch out for a few hours. Meanwhile, I called my roommate at the time and asked if she could come down and bring some food, and my wallet that I had left at home. We combed the airport and found an empty family room, complete with chairs, love seat, and plenty of wall outlets. And even better, it had a door. There was also a large bathroom, but the door was closed. The airport was pretty desolate at this point, and there was no waiting to use the room, so we set our stuff down, plugged in our computers, got out some pillows and snuggled down to watch a movie while we waited. My roommate eventually showed up, and we directed her to the room, over the phone. She brought snacks and drinks and decided to wait with us and give me a ride home after. It was really cool of her, and only like 6 more hours to go. The 3 of us sat in the secluded room, watching movies. My roommate mostly on the phone with her girlfriend. Eventually, sometime during our second movie, I think it was, we were startled by the sound of the door opening. Only, it wasn't the door we came through, which had been closed the entire time. It was the bathroom door. A man walked through the door and sat down across from us. He had been in that bathroom the entire time that we were in there. Stupidly, none of us had bothered to check the bathroom. The light was on, but there hadn't been any sound coming from it. The man sitting across from us was average height, a little bit overweight, dark hair, olive skin. His hair was wet, and he was holding a towel, running it over his head and scrubbing at his hair, the way you do when you've just finished a shower. He didn't have any shoes on. He was barefoot. He had no luggage with him. He was wearing khaki cargo shorts, a white undershirt and an unbuttoned Hawaiian print shirt over the top. At this point, he was just sitting across from us, sitting casually as if he hadn't been in the bathroom for more than 2 hours, silently. Eventually, he broke the tension in the room by asking us where we were flying to. We answered as casually as possible, without giving away any information about ourselves. We asked him where he was going, and he said, wherever the wind takes me. Okay, we were vague, but that was just straight up avoidance. I tried asking where he was from next. Nowhere. I have no home country. I was confused at this point, and I tried to ask him where he'd come from. Was he a local to this city? No. I'm from nowhere. I just go wherever. Okay, so now I'm thinking maybe he is homeless and was just using the bathroom to clean up. No big deal if that's the case. He'll wander off eventually, right? My roommate got up to find a better cell reception and walked out the door we came in through, intentionally leaving it wide open. I could see a few people walking around now, and I immediately felt better. The door is open and he can walk out whenever. We can walk out whenever. People can see us. Everything is going to be okay. My roommate wanders back in and sits down, and we hunker down for another movie. By now, the man is dozing off in the armchair he sat in, and we did our best to just ignore him, making sure the door was left open and people could see us. Sometime during the millionth movie that we were watching, we made a crucial mistake. We got bored and sleepy, and unfortunately, we all dozed off. Stupid, incredibly stupid, I know, but it's just one of those things. You don't realize you've done it until you're waking up. But what we woke up to is forever ingrained in my memory. There was hard banging on the door, the shouting of police officers, something about opening the door and walking out with our hands up. My eyes dart to the door. Why can't they open it? There isn't a lock. But then I see it. At the bottom, there are maybe 3 or 4 industrial box cutters shoved underneath, wedged in to keep the door from opening. My mind is reeling at this point. What the fuck is going on? Did he lock himself in here with us? How could I have fallen asleep? How could we all have fallen asleep? The man then starts talking. Okay, no problem. I'll open the door. Hang on, just a minute. He walks over to the door and pulls the box cutters from under the door, sliding their blades back into their hulls and places them in the pockets of his cargo shorts. He opens the door, and the police immediately handcuff him and escort him away. All the while he's explaining that he just wanted privacy and didn't mean any harm. Sure, dude. You need box cutters shoved under the door for privacy while you're in a secluded room with 3 19-year-old girls? Right. After everything settled, the police asked us if we were okay, and explained to us that apparently they'd been looking for this guy. He allegedly had a habit of coming to that airport and hiding out, harassing people and just being a general nuisance. We assured the police that we were okay, unharmed, and just rattled by the whole situation. In the end, we never did find out where he was from, or where he was going, or even who he was. So yesterday, I was at my sister's house with my mum watching my son and nephews play in the yard. One of my nephews, Harrison, was picking bark off of a tree when I remembered an odd encounter I had as a kid. I said "so weird" out loud, thinking about the encounter. My mum inquired what I was talking about, so I told her. When I was a kid, I was hanging out at the pinecone forest, which was what the neighbourhood kids called a small patch of trees on the side of the road. I was picking bark off of one of the trees to pass some time waiting for my friend Frankie to finish his homework and come out to play. Out of nowhere, it seemed, a guy came up to me. I could smell him before I could see him. He smelled like stale cigarette smoke, and I was kind of scared when I looked at him. He wasn't very old, but he had a really lazy eye that was cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails, they were all stained yellow. My mum taught me to be nice to people, even if they don't look like me, so I faked a smile and just said hello.
"What are you doing?"
He asked me. The smell of his breath was the worst. I'm picking the bark off this tree."
"You shouldn't do that. It's like picking off the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin?"
He said, while slightly pinching my arm with his sharp yellow nails. "I don't know," I replied and took my arm back. Just then, Frankie's mum called for me out the door and told me to come and wait inside. I didn't think anything of the whole thing at the time. When I told my mum about it, she had this look of, I don't know, guilt maybe. She said that it's probably time I know the whole story, and she thought I forgot about the whole encounter, so she never brought it up to me. First, you should know that the neighborhood I grew up in was a small, tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and there was no reason for an outsider to come unless they knew someone there. Anyway, here's what happened with this guy. Frankie's mum, Sonia, noticed a white van with no windows parked on the side of the road. How cliché, right? She didn't recognize it, but figured maybe it was a visitor for a neighbor. Sonia said, or rather told the police, that the van had been there all morning and afternoon. She was kind of just keeping an eye on it. She said that she just had a bad feeling. Her house had a huge window in the front facing the pinecone forest, and the van was parked next to it. She saw me waiting for Frankie and kept a constant eye on the van while holding the phone just in case. She saw the man exit the back of the van and walk up to me. As soon as she saw him grab my arm and pinch me, she called the cops. And that was when she called me into her house. The cops stopped the guy just outside of my neighborhood, and in the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of me taped all over the walls and ceiling. Me at school, at my grandparents' house, at the bank with my mum, just me everywhere I went. But that's not all. He had a key to a storage unit on him, and the cops decided to check it out, considering how creepy things were. Inside the unit, they found a cabinet full of knives. A lot of knives. Paring knives, a butcher's cleaver, a thin fillet knife, a melon baller, and just various knives of all shapes and sizes. There were also a few anatomy books, equipment, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the unit was an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, so it had wrists and ankle straps. And worst of all, the entire inside of the unit was covered in plastic wrap. The last I heard, my mum said that he was in a high-security mental institution for the criminally insane, and I kinda want to keep it that way. I was 12 and my older sister and I were home alone for the weekend. I was waiting for a friend to pick me up and I was getting restless. There was a knock on the door and, thinking it was her, I ran to answer it without checking through the peephole. A man was standing there with a clipboard and said that he needed to check our gas meter. I was entrenched in the disappointment of my friend still not having arrived, so just told him, yeah, sure, whatever you need to do. I didn't notice at the time, but he was dressed as a city official. He had on a green and purple shirt with bold stripes, like the host of Blue's Clues, if you've ever seen that. He came in and immediately went up the stairs to where our bedrooms were and walked into the open door of my room, the typical girly girl room with pink and glitter. Thank God that my sister came down the stairs at almost the exact moment. She said, "Ah, is that Daphne's dad? Why is he going upstairs?" And I complained about how Daphne wasn't here, and was going on about how unreliable she was when my sister cut me off. Wait, if Daphne isn't here, then who's that? I said, apparently he's here to read the gas meters. Her face turned white. She flung open the front door and dragged me out, hand clamped over my protesting mouth. She said, "Our gas meters are outside, you idiot." Neither of us had a cell phone. It was in the 60s, and obviously weren't going back in the house to call authorities on the landline phone. Then, my ever-resourceful sister had a stroke of genius. A man was walking right by her house and she motioned him over. She called loudly into the house. "Oh, Dad, it's good you're home. A man from the city is here to read the gas meter upstairs." And just like she'd hoped, this man on the street said, "Huh? What are you talking about?" The man in the striped shirt bolted out of the house. The man on the street asked us repeatedly if we were okay, if we needed him to stay and wait in the yard with us until our parents came home. He was really sweet. We were so startled that we barely thanked him before slamming and locking the doors and windows. As irate as my sister was that I let someone in the house, she begged me not to call the authorities because my parents left her in charge, and she was worried that she'd get in trouble. I didn't want to catch any heat from carelessly allowing some guy in, so I was kind of on the same page too. 3 weeks later, a girl in our community, she went missing. It was in the same neighborhood even, and she was home alone, and the authorities found the door open, and no signs of forced entry. My sister and I discussed our options, but deep down, we knew that we had no choice but to come clean. We told the police everything, and I don't know if it ever helped, but they told us that they had reason to believe that it could have been the same man. They also tracked down the man who helped us on the street. Turns out, we already knew him. He worked in the butcher shop. We just didn't recognize him. He was lifelong friends with the family after that too. Our parents were obviously mortified. They weren't angry with us, just glad that we were okay. Though they did review all the rules of caution and didn't leave us home alone for quite a while. They eventually found the girl and said that she'd been held for a few days and then burnt alive, apparently. They never caught the man either. He was in what appeared to be his early 30s in the 1960s. So, in any case, he's probably dead by now. I just thank God every day for my sister's resourcefulness and quick action. Back when I was in the army, we ran into something pretty unexplainable during a regular navigation exercise. So, navigation exercises are pretty standard around the world. Given a map and some coordinates, you have to find checkpoints using a compass. Of course, each squad was given a signal set to use in case of emergencies, or just to add to the weight that they had to lug around. It's part of their kit anyway. There's a GPS embedded inside, but it's old school and gives coordinates only. Close to the end of the exercise, a squad had fallen hopelessly behind, but they were on their way to the last checkpoint. So, I was in charge of the last checkpoint with another fellow instructor. We knew that they were around us in a 1 kilometer radius, but we just couldn't spot them due to the foliage. We waited and waited for about 1 or 2 hours. And, to put it bluntly, you don't mess up so friggin' bad that you can't figure out a checkpoint that's only 1 kilometer away. We radioed them and didn't get a reply till half an hour after the initial call. And they were totally frantic. It seems like they were walking around in circles and seeing similar landmarks. It was apparently pitch dark at where they were, and this was around 6 PM, where the sun was only just starting to set. Myself and the other trainer told them not to move, and we'd hike to their position using an electronic GPS. And at the coordinates given, we found no one. And not only that, but the forest was eerily quiet. No insects, no birds, just complete dead silence. It was pretty unnerving, I must admit. Even the radio was set silent. Not even static was coming out. We radioed them again, confused, and they said that they were at the same coordinates as us, but I didn't see anyone. We decided to hike back to the checkpoint and wait, and we gave them the coordinates to the checkpoint. About an hour later, they finally emerged. It took them 4 hours plus to find a checkpoint that was only like 1 kilometer away. During final briefing, one of them told me that they seemed to be just going around in circles. They kept leaving marks on trees using a blade, but when they came back to what should have been the tree that they marked, the mark was gone. They also said something a little creepy. They all felt like they were being followed. But that should just be the forest and exhaustion playing tricks on them, right? Many moons ago, I was an editor. I was cutting a commercial late at night on one occasion, and the deadline required that I stay overnight to finish. I'm on the second floor of a 30-story building. Half the floor is editing suites, and the rest is rented out to various businesses like designers and developers, mostly tech companies.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
Idiot sandwich what?
An idiot sandwich, Chef Ramsay.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
Idiot sandwich what?
An idiot sandwich, Chef Ramsay.
Except for one office, which was the largest on the floor, about 600 square feet, and belonged to a psychiatrist. It's about 3 AM and I'm super focused on my work, when suddenly I realize that I'm absolutely starving. There's a deli across the street from me, which is 24/7, so I decided to go and get some food. All of the offices have sliding frosted glass doors, and I open mine and realize that the floor is completely empty and dark. Save for the emergency exit lights, it's completely dead. I get my food and come back, close the door and watch some YouTube while I sat there. Suddenly, I hear the elevator bing down the hallway. I knew that the entire building except for the 19th floor was empty. The 19th floor was some French company, and there wasn't even anyone at the front desk. You had to swipe in with a keycard at 2 doors in the lobby. I slowly slide the door quietly and stick my head out of the office. And there's nothing. I see the light from inside the elevator, casting a light onto the floor. But I couldn't see in because the way the hallway was set up. Eventually, I lock the office door, put my giant headphones on, and just get back to work. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because around 5:30, a loud knocking on the glass wakes me up. I jump up and open the door and see one of the building managers and a cop. I walk out into the hallway and hear a commotion and see more cops. They ask me what I'm doing here, so I explain. They ask if I saw or heard anything, and I say no because obviously I had headphones on and I fell asleep, etc. The cop walks away to the other cops and I ask the manager what's going on, and she tells me that someone apparently broke into the building, somehow bypassing the 2 doors downstairs that required a keycard, broke into the psychiatrist's office, and stole files on 3 patients, according to what the doctor had told her and the cops. I was there that whole time, either working or asleep, and I didn't hear a thing. When she told me this, I almost crapped myself. I mean, to go after 3 specific files takes some serious dedication to your mission. All I could think about was, since it wasn't some petty robbery, and there are tech offices all over the floor, I kept thinking what might have happened to me had I run into this guy. I ended up leaving that place several months later. So, there was this lady, my friend's half-sister's mum, if that makes any sense, who would cut my hair at my house. She had a boyfriend who I had met once, very briefly. About a year after meeting him, she came over to cut my hair, but this time she unexpectedly brought her boyfriend along with her. I hadn't seen her in a while, and it seemed like something was different, and he was also acting really odd. She went to the bathroom and he began proposing that we hang out sometime, but she can't know, and I'm serious. I said sure, just to get him off my back. I honestly thought that they were on drugs or something, and I was just trying to keep everything peaceful and get them out of there ASAP. As they were finally leaving, he's behind her and he goes to wave goodbye and throws a note on the ground that said, "Call me, it's our secret, promise," with his phone number on it. Obviously, I did not call. 2 days later, I kept getting missed calls from a number that I didn't recognize. I never answered them, and then, eventually, I got a text message saying, "Hey, it's Ray." That was his name. "Can you please call me? I really need your help with something." Again, I just didn't respond. He kept texting me saying that he needed a favor, and since I never gave him my phone number to begin with, and since this man knows where I live, I was pretty alarmed at this point. I tried to go to the police station to see if there was anything that they could do, but the station I went to was not open to the public. That was the only station I knew of, too. I could have looked up another one, but I kind of felt stupid for being there in the first place, you know. So, I just went home. The next morning at 8 a.m., I wake up to really loud banging on my door. I couldn't see anyone out the window, and I don't have a peephole, so I opened the door a little bit. I thought it could have been my parents, since I live right by them. But no, it was Ray. He was pressed up against the door, which is why I couldn't see him out of the window. He was smiling, and I just quickly shut the door and called 911. He left before the cops showed up and sent a text message to the effect of, "I don't want to inconvenience you, sorry to bug you." The cop told me to text him back saying, "Do not contact me in any way, shape or form, or I'll go to the police again," and made me take a picture of the cop car in front of my house and send that too. And then he left, saying that it's not illegal for someone to like you. Right. Well, the next day I got another missed call from Ray's number, so I went to a different police station. The usual front desk person was sick, and the man filling in for her was a cop. He seemed like he actually wanted to help me, and after a quick typing of Ray's phone number to his computer, he had me come around to identify his mugshot. And it turns out that Ray is a level 3 sex offender, which means that he's a child rapist to be exact. He apparently wasn't even allowed in my state. The cop also said that that was just the beginning of it, but wasn't allowed to further discuss his charges. Though he did mention that I was Ray's type. I was 23 at the time, but I could have pulled off 15 or 16. Ray, he was 38. So I had to take screenshots of every missed call and every text message, take pictures of the note, put the note in a baggie and bring it to the police. I googled his name and found some articles about him being a sex offender, so it must have been all true. I printed them out along with my screenshots and took them to the courthouse to file a stalking order. It should have been just a harassment order, but the lady there told me to put a stalking one so I wouldn't have to pay the $85 fee. Eventually, the cops, they found him a few days later, arrested him and served him his papers. We had a court date, which he didn't show up for, and I was given a 10-year protection order. Last I heard, he was released from jail, but went back for burglary. So, I don't know if I would say that this is all possibly paranormal, but it was damn weird. I've had several dreams similar to what I'm posting. I've been a caver in Florida for about 13 years, since I was about 6 in fact, and have been to a lot of caves. And I've never been afraid before this to go into one. So, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I started having this reoccurring dream. I would have it at least twice a year, always the same, even though I would realize that I was dreaming after the first few iterations. I would fall asleep and dream of being in a cave and going into this little hole in the bottom. Inside, I would see a 10 to 15 foot long corridor about 2 to 4 feet high. At the end, it would always turn left, and I always saw a bent red stop sign at the end, like someone ripped off the top 2 feet and tossed it in. But I would always follow the corridor. I would turn and walk past the sign despite being scared, despite many times knowing what was there, and the corridor would start descending, quickly opening up in a large vertical chamber with the path leading down in a corkscrew. Everything became blurry at this point though, but it was always the same. I saw trash scattered on the walls. I saw the pit leading down to a curved floor. I saw things, undefined, animals or people or something else at the bottom. And I saw my family, each with one of the things being tortured and killed. Every time, and I could never do anything. After I saw that, I would be stuck for a few seconds until I felt more than saw everything turn and look at me. And then I would wake up. Not like a normal dream where you just drift to consciousness, or a nightmare where you bolt up in fear, but like something had pushed me out. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. So, I have this dream multiple times a year until I turned 15, and my father decided to take us to some caves that we had never been to before, one of which was Dog Drop. It was likely named so because someone either threw their pet in there or a coyote fell in and the body was later discovered there. The Dog Drop had a roughly 30-foot rappel straight down to enter. I went down with my brother while my father waited up at the top. There was a hole in the ground, and I started to feel uneasy, though I didn't know why. So I followed my brother into the hole. I felt worse as I moved on, though, and when I looked up, I saw the same corridor, the same turn, the same wall, the same bottles at the corner, and I was instantly hit with this overwhelming sense of nausea and fear and being watched, and everything was screaming at me to just leave. I froze and must have made some noise because my brother turned around and asked what was wrong. I managed to say that I wanted to leave now, and I just climbed out as quickly as I could, followed immediately by my brother. We packed up and left, and I've never gone back, and honestly, I never will. I haven't told anyone about what actually happened, just said that I wasn't feeling well, and they forgot pretty quickly. But the thing that really makes this whole thing creepy for me is that I've never had that dream again. Year after year, I would have it consistently, but it just stopped after that. But I still remember it all, and I'm still afraid. Almost an external fear when I think of it. This story is about an event that happened to my mother around 1972 when she was 8 years old. She told me about it since I was young, and she truly thinks about it, and it's affected her to this day. To set the scene, both my grandparents ran a restaurant, gas station in our hometown. They have always ran a business of some type since the 50s. This means that a lot of days, my mum would have to take the school bus home and stay by herself if my grandma had to stay back and help run things. It was usually no more than an hour or two, though. My uncle, her older brother, would usually come home on the bus with her, but he was a little older and sometimes had football practice. So was the case on the day of the event that I'm getting to. So, my mother arrived home on this day, let herself in the house and put away her things. She had just recently received a new puppy, and knew the first thing that she needed to do was take the pup out to the yard to use the restroom. She wrapped the dog in a white towel and walked him outside. As she put down the dog, she shook its hair out of the blanket, flailing it about in the wind. And it was then that she noticed the neighbor's son was staring at her from across the street. This guy was in his late 20s and was known by everyone to be pretty strange and mentally ill. Though, in this country, a mental illness seems to not always be recognized. He would do psycho shit, like kill the neighbor's pigs or skin stray cats and hang them from a clothesline in their yard or something. Just really sick shit. My mum always said that he creeped her out, and everyone else too. She said that he would stare at her when she would play outside and made her feel pretty generally uncomfortable. She said that he appeared out of nowhere in his yard that day, and as she shook out the blanket, he began grinning and waving. Feeling more than a little shook, she picked up her pup, went inside and locked the door. She began to do some homework, and after about 5 minutes of work, she heard a loud knock at the door. She slowly walked to the window to see who it was. She knew it wasn't my grandparents because, of course, they had keys. As she opened the blinds, her eyes locked with those of the creep from across the street, like he was already looking in the window. She jumped and said that she screamed a little as she shut the blinds. She walked to the door and made sure that it was locked. She said that he just continued with a slow and continuous thud on the door, almost in a rhythm. Then, she really got terrified as he began speaking to her through the door. "Hi, sweetie. I saw you with your doggy. Let me in to see him." She was in total shock. "Come on, let me in, sweetie. Please, I want to see your puppy." In full freak-out mode, my mum screamed, "You need to leave now. You need to go back to your house. I don't know you." But he just kept knocking. I can actually see the fear in my mum's eyes when she describes that part, and it gives my whole body chills. He said, "Just let me in, okay? I saw you wave your flag of surrender." I shit you not. The guy thought that my mum shaking hair from the blanket was a flag of surrender and a sign for him to come over. My mum screamed, "I'm calling my daddy and the police if you don't leave now." And with this, the knocking stopped. She tried to catch her breath and shake off her fear. She then got up from the door and ran to the basement level of the home. It was an old house, so the kitchen and rec room were down there along with the only phone in the house. She made it to the phone and began to dial 911. All of a sudden, she heard a shatter from the next room. She looked over to see the crazed neighbor attempting to crawl through the kitchen window. He was ripping down the curtain as his upper body got through, and my mother screamed what was happening to the police on the phone. All of a sudden, he was bleeding from the abdomen where the window glass had cut him as his lower half couldn't squeeze through. And then my mum began hearing my grandmother's screams. "What the hell are you doing?" Then, the guy yelling in pain and squirming at the window as she hit him from behind with some tool that was laying in her garden on the side of the house where the entrance to the window was. He managed to get out the window and bolted to his house. The police came and Grandma called my grandfather, and he arrived as well after shutting down the business as soon as she told him. They arrested him for breaking and entering and something else I believe that was unrelated. A probation violation, I assume. On the day of his court date, he told them the white flag of surrender story. But this was the final nut on his crazy cake, as they put him in a mental institution that day. He may have gotten out at some stage, but went back because my mother said that he later died in that institution. Outside the courthouse, the crazy Appalachian redneck family of the creep tried to blame me, my 8-year-old self, and my mother, and the man's father called my mother a harlot. Needless to say, my army-trained grandpa beat the guy's ass on the courthouse steps as the local cops turned a blind eye. That story has always stuck with me. My mum had to receive therapy for it, so it haunts her a lot too, to this day even. We always can't help but wonder though, what would he have done if my grandma didn't come home at that moment? When I lived in Montana, I used to like to go backpacking on the weekends. I'd usually find an alpine lake to hike to, far away from any trails, and plot a course along a river or stream and spend the night there, then climb the closest peak in the morning. However, I was smart about it. I'd always tell friends where I went and when to expect me home. Except the first time. The first time I went backpacking and did an overnight by myself in the mountains, I climbed up the trail that was quite literally right behind my house. It was spring at the time, so there was still snow on top of the mountains. Now, this area of Montana had no cell service. My neighbors had a cell repeater that ran the cell service over the internet or something, but once you were a few hundred yards away from the house, there was absolutely nothing. So, I hiked about 11 miles up the steepest, most arduous trail that you could think of. I wanted to make it to Tabletop Mountain because, in my naivety, I thought, yeah, I want to camp on top of that. I get to the ridgeline of the mountains, and at this point, I'm exhausted. I'm using subpar equipment and a really shitty old external frame backpack that put the weight nowhere near my hips. Not to mention that I had only started in the early afternoon and had essentially jogged up the first mile or two of the trail. The wind had also picked up something fierce, to the point where I couldn't even see the top of the mountain from about 400 meters away because of the snow blowing around. Knowing that I couldn't hike down at that point, it was getting dark, I just decided to set up camp. Unfortunately, I'm standing on the ridge of a mountain. I can't camp on the top because it's way too windy. And obviously, there's nowhere to camp on the side because it's a fucking mountain, and it's really steep on both sides. So, I find a little nook in the side of the mountain and dug in a flat spot into the snow and set up my tent there. Luckily, that seemed to work well enough. The tent was set up fine and I got everything ready for bed. Being as cold as it was, I decided I wanted to start a fire. And it was then that I learned that the fancy waterproof phosphorus matches that I bought don't fucking burn at 10,000 feet. They just barely smoldered, in fact. And I didn't have a camp stove at that point, so with nowhere to start a fire, the sun going down and the wind picking up, I just decided to call it a night and tried to get some sleep. Somehow, I eventually fell asleep. I attribute it to the white noise effect of the wind in my tent. But now, here comes the creepy part. I wake up in the middle of the night and it's dead silent. No sound at all. Now, I'm not talking the quiet that you get in your bedroom at 3 a.m. I'm talking, like, literally, I cannot hear anything other than my own heartbeat. I was holding my breath. There's no wind, no trees rustling, no tent flapping, no snow blowing against the side of my tent. Literally nothing. At that point, I was at least 7 miles as the crow flies from any human, any road, or any speck of civilization. Now, you may not think that hearing nothing in nature is scary, but if you've ever been in nature, you know that the forest has a soundtrack. You hear the birds singing, the wind blowing, the river running, the trees swaying and creaking. So, to hear nothing is odd, very creepy in itself. Kind of like the something bad is about to happen creepy feeling that you get. Except, I had no escape. Where could I go other than my tent? One wrong step outside and I'd fall down the mountainside. Not to mention that, well, I was completely alone. No one was coming to save me. No one even knew that I was there. As if nature was inside of my head and listening, it finally gave me something to listen to. Footsteps. The unmistakable, undeniable sound of feet on snow. Somewhere outside of my tent, within earshot of me. A million things raced through my mind. The first being, why am I awake now? And my body must have woken me up for a good reason. And did I just imagine that? And what the hell would be walking around up here? Again, as if someone was listening to my inner dialogue, I heard the footsteps again. I froze because I didn't know what to do. They were So clear though. Were they 10 feet away? 5 feet? What were they? Or who were they? I didn't know what to do, and I was paralyzed with fear. I listened to the footsteps for 30 seconds, take a few steps, then pause, and then a few more. Finally, I couldn't take it. I had to do something, but I couldn't rightly get out of my tent without making a noise. The zippers are loud as hell, especially in the silence, and any sound that I made was seemingly magnified. So, I did the only thing that I could. I screamed as loud as I could. My heart was racing, the hair on my neck was raised, my knife in one hand and flashlight in the other, waiting for my unknown adversary's move. My ears were straining to hear anything over the sound of my quickened breath, and my heart pounding in my head. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. I begged to hear something, to hear footsteps running away. I pleaded with nature to give me some sort of sign that I was safe. But there was nothing. It was silent once more. It took me a good hour of reading to calm down after that. Thankfully, and I know this is weird to say, on top of a mountain, the wind picked up and I couldn't hear anything once again and fell into a very shallow sleep until the morning. When I woke up, I looked for footsteps, but the wind had blown any away. 20 minutes after the sun was up, I was packed and headed back down the mountain. I never camped again without telling someone where I was. So, if I hear absolutely nothing out in the bush, I always leave immediately. I've learned from experience that this is the best thing to do. The first time that this happened, I was about 4, and my parents were bringing my mum's parents up to the lake near my hometown for their first time, and to show them the stone arch. They decided to put it on the west side of the lake, where a guy still had a barn, the only structure left from when the town was flooded out a few years earlier, when the dam was put in. The dude also ranged cattle up there as well, and this was just down from the arch, and there was a longer trail that headed to it from that beach. Anyways, we get out of the boat, and my mum, who was about 70% deaf, and my grandma started setting up for us to have lunch, while my brother and we started poking around the beach, and my dad and grandpa head up to the trees to get some firewood. I remember the rest of us not wanting to go near the trees, and my mum was getting everything ready near the boat, which was pretty unusual. A few minutes later, and my dad and grandpa are telling us that we're leaving, and going across the lake for lunch, and to pack up now. My dad later told me that the deeper they went from the tree line, the quieter and creepier it got. And my grandpa, who survived storming Juno Beach and grew up hunting and trapping in the northern bushes, he said that we absolutely needed to leave since all the hairs on his neck, they were up. My dad was telling this around the table with our friends one night, and our hiking buddy then got to tell us his story. Him and his friend put in on the same beach to get to the arch because the main trail had gotten eroded from heavy rains that spring. They're hiking in, and it's quieter than normal in the trees. As they get to the level portion of the trail, it gets really quiet, and they start smelling something funky, like skunk mixed with rot. The smell and the quiet got a bit stronger until they popped out into a clearing. The dead quiet was overwhelming, along with the stench. Most of the stench was allegedly coming from a dead cow. There was still the skunk smell mixed in with the rotting smell, but there was a dead cow that was spread all over the clearing, like way up in the surrounding trees spread. Chunks of cow meat hanging from branches 40 feet up in the trees. Our buddy said that it looked like the cow ate dynamite. Despite knowing that you don't run in the bush, he said that they looked at each other and just sprinted the fuck out of there because they felt like they were being watched. Nobody I know will go to that side of the lake between the arch and some cottages way to the south. And I sure as hell won't be either. I've always wanted to share this, but could never find the right place. For reference, at the time this all began, I was 14 and a freshman in high school, back in 2008-2009, so it's not recent. It all began during the first couple of weeks of school. I went to this school district all my life and never had any real issues, since I had no enemies and only friends really. It all began one Friday afternoon after school. I was hanging out with some friends outside of the school until my mum came to pick me up when I decided to go upstairs to my locker and put a textbook away that I was originally going to bring home for the weekend. When I got to my locker, there was a note taped onto it. My name was written on it with a heart around it, and I read it. It was a love letter signed Your Secret Admirer. Thinking that it was a friend playing a prank, I laughed it off and tossed it into the trash. When I confronted them downstairs, they denied that they put a note on my locker and insisted that it was probably from a boy or something. I didn't know what to think, but I did think of a few cute guys that I went to school with and hoped that it was from one of them. But I sighed and thought that it could have been anyone, and most likely none of them. 2 months go by, and during this time, we had school picture day, and my mum had ordered some, which were eventually given to us during one of our classes. I kept them in my locker so I wouldn't lose them. It was a Friday, and I was going to stay after school with some friends again and hang around until the high school football team was over late in the evening. I waited until about 2 hours after school ended, or so, to grab my belongings out from my locker, including the photos. I put them in my backpack and headed on outside, and hung out around the football field with my friends until people started showing up for the game, to which we walked around or sat in the grass and talked the rest of the evening. When I got home that night, I gave my mum the photos, and she noticed that one of the wallet-sized photos had been cut off from the rest. I never bothered to look at all of them, and so I wasn't aware of this. Obviously, I told her that I didn't cut one, but she didn't believe me. And I had no idea what to think of it. A few weeks go by, and I all but forgot about the missing photo. But I found another note taped to my locker, and this time, one of my school photos was in it with a heart drawn around my head. A wallet-sized photo, too. The note made mention of how beautiful I looked during the game, sitting with my friends in the grass, talking and laughing. This obviously made me a bit uncomfortable. Whoever's doing this had stolen one of my photos, either out of my locker during school, which means that they have my lock combination, on that Friday, or while I left my backpack unattended during the football game. Once again, I thought that it was probably just one of my friends playing a prank on me, and I didn't say anything about it. It had been several months since the last note, too. Things took a rather stressful turn, though, the following week. I was at home after school one day, alone, while my mum was working a double shift, when someone came knocking on my front door. Thinking it was just a pesky neighbour, I took my sweet time to answer it and open the door to find nobody there. I looked around and saw nothing but other mobile homes and neighbors' cars. I shut the door and resumed what I was doing. But I heard the knocking again about 10 minutes later. I took my time again to answer it and found Mike, one of our only friendly male neighbours, there with his Boston Terrier on a leash. He asked me if I had somebody over, which obviously I didn't. He then told me that he allegedly saw somebody snooping around my home a few minutes ago. I felt uncomfortable now and said that I didn't have anyone over and asked who it was, and he said that he didn't recognize him. I thanked him and locked all my doors and windows after he left, quick smart. The next month was full of incidences where our motion sensor backlight would just come on in the evening and was capped off by my mum calling the police after she found a dead rabbit nailed to our back porch in a rather cruel fashion. At the time, I never would have imagined that the notes, the snooping around, and now the dead rabbit was the work of someone who had been stalking me in the shadows for the last several months. But it all came into fruition the following day at school. I found a final note taped to my locker. There was a big bulge in it, and when I took it apart, the foot of a rabbit fell onto the floor in front of me. I shrieked in terror as a teacher came running up to me, and I pointed out the rabbit's foot. He picked it up at once and asked me where it came from. I showed him the note, and we immediately went into the office and showed the vice principal what we found. Later in the day, I was called into the office and found my mum there with the principal and vice principal. It was there that I had to recount the events over the last couple of months for the first time to anyone, and give the names of students that I think may have been responsible based on any suspicious interactions that I had through social media or in school. But I never had anyone that seemed off to me. They told me that if anything were to happen again, to let them know and they'll get the police involved if my life appears to be in danger or anything. My mum had already contacted the state trooper who visited our home the previous night about the rabbit's foot being found on my locker at school and how a student may have been involved in it. From that day onward, nothing else major happened. However, about halfway through my junior year, I got another love letter, and this time, instead of it being written by hand, it was typed out and signed, "Your secret admirer from freshman year." I had all but forgotten about what had happened during my freshman year. I kept this note and gave it to the principal, who kept it as evidence in case things escalated again, but they never did. Luckily, nothing else happened afterwards. At least, nothing that was obvious anyway. But I must admit that every now and then, I find myself looking over my shoulder. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night, I was bored and decided to go and try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area, a nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a pretty stupid idea since I was all by myself and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign saying park closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with the mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times, I thought I heard a little bit of rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully the deer that I'd come to see. After I'd hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no darkness, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little bit more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for the deer. I didn't get to see any, but what I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this. There was a man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction that I'd come, and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was also carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, and a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman, alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it, lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was so able to see in the dark, but I guess his eyes had adjusted or something, and I was terrified that he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around, but I couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises that I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I'd turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought any more about it. But now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car. If he'd circled back and seen my parked car, alone in the lot. If he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably another half hour or so. And there was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure that he was going to look up and find me. But luckily, he he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I actually heard him say, "Fuck it," and he started heading back in the direction that he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in that tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Only then I climbed down, and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had definitely been there, because my windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped down all the sides of my car with something sharp. Presumably, a giant knife that, I'm lucky, didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me. And thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. G'day mates, it's B-Busty.
G'day mates. So I wanted to grab you all really quickly just before the video starts. Firstly, I want to give a big shout out to everyone who sent their stories in. Thank you all so much for sharing your stories with me. If your story did not make it, don't worry, get together in groups, send me a photo quickly guys, as Number 20. So, I was 17 years old. My then boyfriend and I were out on a farm access road. Only one way in and out. It was November, it wasn't really cold, but it was cloudy. I had my window rolled down a few inches because Bob was having a cigarette while trying to find something decent on the radio. I was sitting cross-legged with my back against the passenger door. On both sides of us was empty fields because it was past harvest. I happened to look out the back driver's seat window and saw the silhouette of two men who looked like they were carrying rifles. When they saw me looking at them, they moved to the rear of the car and ducked behind it. I should have heard the footsteps on the gravel with my window being opened, and I heard nothing though. I went ballistic. I started locking car doors and screaming for Bob to start the engine. I never took my eyes off the rear of the car. At first he thought I was dicking with him and laughed, but the panic in my voice got him motivated. I screamed, "There are two guys out there, and I think they have guns." He turned on the lights and started to peel out of there. I fully expected to see two guys eating our dust and cursing us out at the taillights, but nothing was there. At the end of the road, Bob stopped and asked what the hell that was all about. I could barely talk, but told him what I saw. He'd been coming to this place for years with girls and nothing ever happened. I said maybe it was the farmer with another man and they were trying to scare us. He said this wasn't possible because he knew the farmer, and had it been him he would have driven down the same road we were on. He lived too far away to chance walking across fields at night with no flashlights. I said, could it be illegal hunters? He said all the land was posted for no hunting because there were homes scattered along the main road that led to the access road. If they fired weapons, someone would hear them and call the police. There would have been no reason for them to run or hide from us. We were two teens in a car and they were grown men with weapons. I was very shaken and Bob took me home. I mulled it over in my mind trying to find a rational explanation. Bob never saw anything, so obviously he doubted my story. We stopped dating after that night. I think I scared the hell out of him. So what did I see? Damned if I know, but I can tell you I saw it. I'm now 62 years old, and I can't remember ever being that scared before or since. Something was not right about those things that I saw. They were blacker than the night and distinctively solid, but I could see no facial features. Their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, yet they made no sound. I wouldn't even be repeating this story if not for finding a few stories like this 45 years after the fact on the internet. Just for the record, we were not drinking or smoking weed or doing any mind-altering drugs. Did I matrix the whole thing? I could have, but around here kids always hung out in the farmlands or mountains, and I was one of them, and never encountered anything like that night.
Number 19.
Here's what happened to me one night. When I was around 15 last year, I was at home, alone with my friend. Keep in mind, I live in Canada and we don't have very much crime in the city where I live. It was around 1 in the morning. I was, and still am, very paranoid about people breaking into my house or doing something to harm me. I always kept a knife handy or some sort of a baton. My friend and I were playing Xbox upstairs, and after a while of not eating, we decided to go downstairs to get something to eat and drink. This was a big mistake. It was dark in the hallway, the only light switch being 10 feet away. Me being paranoid, I brought my baton and knife with me downstairs. I turned on the light and we proceeded to head downstairs, and when we got to the bottom it was pitch black. We couldn't see a thing. We bumped into things trying to find the light switch, and after a minute or so of hitting our toes on tables and couches, we found the light switch and turned it on. I always felt safe with the lights on, and I placed my baton and knife on the kitchen table and we went to the fridge to get some pop. But then we heard a tapping noise coming from the window, I'd say 15 feet away from us across the room. I gave my friend my knife and got my baton, and we thought it may have been the 17-year-old that lives beside us that scares us every so often. So we said... We continued to hear this noise though, and I got a little scared, so I gripped my baton really hard. We heard a really loud bang on the window, and I knew right then it wasn't Dylan. We bolted upstairs and didn't even grab what we came down for, we were that scared. We jumped up the stairs while running, and we almost ran into the door, but I got myself to stop before the door. We opened it and shut it extremely fast and then locked the door from the inside. I then proceeded to get on the phone to call my dad's friend, which is a police officer 5 houses down from us. But the portable phone wasn't charged. I thought we were going to die because we couldn't call the police. I just remembered that my dad has cases and the key and bolt back into my room. I frantically try and open it, and I got it open. I took out the gun and loaded it with the magazine. I cocked it back while I looked out my bedroom window to find a man standing there. He was smiling. This scared the shit out of us. We yelled at him to get the fuck out of our property before we grab our guns and shoot him. I pointed my dad's pistol out at the window, right at him. I really did not want to have to shoot someone. My hand was shaking so hard that I probably couldn't even hit him if I wanted to. It was very easy to see us from the window because we have the light on, so it was clear to him I had a gun. He ran into the surrounding woods by my house. My friend and I told my parents about this, and this scared the shit out of them. They called the police and told them what happened. They caught the guy breaking into another house a week later. The guy was caught after he had stabbed a woman who was living alone in the house. The police called me in for an interview and to see if I could identify who the guy was. He was the killer. He also confessed that he had killed other people before. I was absolutely terrified. Since then, my father bought me a firearm and put it in a secure location in my room. I hope I never have to use it though.
Number 18.
This is a creepy story that happened to my girlfriend. I dropped my girlfriend off at her grandmother's place for the night. I got home, and like normal I sent her a text letting her know I made it home safely. I didn't get a response though. I figured she had just fallen asleep or got caught up talking to her grandmother, so I just shrugged it off. Maybe 20 minutes go by and I get a call from a very panicked girlfriend. She's saying how someone tried to break into the house. The guy never got in because the police were able to get there in time. When I asked just what happened, she said the following happened. Her grandmother came home at about 10:30 that night from a church function. My girlfriend was helping her grandmother unload groceries from the car. As my girlfriend was getting the bags from the trunk, out of nowhere, this Hispanic guy in his early 20s was standing behind my girlfriend. He must have stood there for about 30 seconds, not saying anything. When my girlfriend turned around, she screamed, seeing the man with his big ear-to-ear grin across his face. He didn't say anything or move. He just stood there, towering over my girlfriend. She and her grandmother bolted to the door, leaving everything behind in the car. The man started going through the car as if he was looking for something. This went on for maybe a good 5 minutes. By then the cops were called. The man walked up to the door and started ringing the doorbell and knocking on the door. He was saying how he knew them and he just wanted to talk, all while having that big ear-to-ear grin across his face. The next part is just really odd. He laid down in front of the door and actually went to sleep. Another 5 minutes go by and now the cops are at my girlfriend's place. The cops arrested him and started asking me questions, as well as my girlfriend and her grandmother. While the cops are getting statements from my girlfriend and her grandmother, the Hispanic man just had that ear-to-ear smile as he looked back at my girlfriend. The cops place the man in the back of the cop car and drive away. As my girlfriend watches the car drive away, the man still has that smile on his face. I don't want to even think about what could have happened if things got even worse.
Number 70.
I started working in a nursing home in my hometown when I was 18. I was one of the youngest nurses' assistants on my shift, and needless to say, I was the one that got pranked and scared shitless during the whole shift. I worked 2 to 10 and many times 10 to 6 since I was young and had no life at the time. I didn't mind, the money was good, and I loved the people. One night, we had a woman go a little batshit crazy. I'll call her Norma. She was one of my favourites, and I was the one she always called for when she needed something, like a bath or just a regular conversation. She started walking the halls with her Bible, trying to get out, even went as far as biting some of my co-workers, and I was the only one that could get her back in her room and back to bed. One day, I came into work, and my boss informed me that she had to go away to an institution. He said that they couldn't get her in the van, and I seemed to be their go-to person when it came to convincing someone to do something, since all the residents seemed to love me. Making fixed eye contact with Becca. But she eventually lost track of the hell hag, and we continued on almost completely undisturbed, until out of the clear blue, we hear Becca scream bloody murder and break down into a panic, begging to be let out. So we tried our hardest to rush her out. All the while, it sounded like we wiped the entire ward into a frenzy. Doors slamming, screaming, laughing, banging, and more was heard the entire way through the ward, back to the stairwell we had used to come up. All the while, Becca was shouting not to let that bitch take her back there, not to let that bitch touch her again. Well, we made it out safely and kept running. We finally stopped and were able to calm Becca down. When we finally got a straight sentence out of her, she told us her back was killing her. When we looked at her back, it was a bloody mess, with 6 deep gouges all over her back, dug fairly deep, and all drenched in blood. She looked like a right mess, and was refusing to tell us what she saw, just begging to get the fuck out of there.
Number 1.
I was 15, my name's Jessica, and my brother Jonathan was 17. This took place in a safe, affluent suburb of Detroit. I was living with my dad in Phoenix while I was recovering from a brain tumor. My grandmother, who had a very large presence in our lives, offered to have my brother live with her and her husband, so he doesn't have to move schools for his last year of high school. This was not very unusual for my granny to help and offer. In fact, before my accident, I slept over nearly every Friday night for Shabbat dinner. I loved her so much, and so did my brother. We felt so comfortable with her. She was like one of our parents. My mother has always been suicidal and mentally unstable. My mother had a hard time raising us kids, so my grandmother stepped in a lot. I'm 18 now, and I still don't have any answers as to why she did what she did. What really freaked me out was the timing. Just weeks before, she and my brother visited me in Phoenix Children's Hospital for days. She was feeding me home-cooked meals, reading my books and magazines, and checking on my car from the nurses. Several days after my brother and Granny returned home, my dad and I scheduled to move back home so I could start my physical therapy there. Everyone was glad we were coming back home. My granny killed my brother 5 days before we were moving out. While it is unfortunate, I understand that parents, spouses, kids, or even grandparents kill their loved ones. But my grandmother's story is very strange because suddenly she gunned down my brother while he was dying on the phone with 911. This showed she was relentless and wanted to finish him off no matter how incriminating, sickening, or cruel. Once in a while I will review his 911 tape recording because it is the only way I can hear his voice again. It is sad to think that a loving Jewish grandmother would snap like this. There was no reason as to why she wanted to kill her grandson. She just snapped, or maybe she was suppressing her desires for so long she couldn't hold it in any longer. My mum suspects after this tragedy that my grandmother also poisoned her own mother because she insisted that her mother was going to die that night, and her last meal was matzo ball soup. I digress. You can listen to his call here. Listen at your own risk. Having a video like this conditions people and makes them sympathize with the right person, the person who died. You can clearly learn from the tape who the real crazed devil is. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Well, did you make it through all to the way, guys? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. I would just like to give a huge shout out to everyone who has been sending stories in. Thank you all so much, and don't be discouraged if yours did not make it in this time around, as there will be plenty more opportunities in the future. And if you haven't submitted a story yet, you can send me a story in my email, which I'll leave in the description below. A big shout out also goes to James Riley from Freak Static for his amazing thumbnail. There's a link in the description so you guys can go check out his work and show him heaps of support. Thanks for being patient with this one, guys, as well. These larger videos do take some time, and when I do the subscriber stories, I always want to try and make them as good as I possibly can, given that they're your stories. As always, guys, thank you all so much for your support. The hive is still growing rapidly, and I have all of you to thank for that. And on that note, it would be awesome if you could like, share, subscribe if you're new, and let me know what you'd like to see in the future. You can catch me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram throughout the week, all of which I've left links in the description below for. Also, guys, I just wanted to give you all the heads up that there are a lot of B-Buster mimic channels and websites showing up. So I just wanted to put this out there to save you guys a whole lot of potential hassle and problems. If you guys don't hear directly from this channel about something I'm doing and a direct announcement from me here, then don't trust it, as I'll always let you guys know what's going on. Alright guys, I won't make this video any longer. Thank you all once again for your stories and support. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you mates in the next one.
My uncle Carlos is a private investigator in Mexico, in a sort of middle-class area. Not exactly paradise by American standards, but far from the cartel night. This was 2010. I had just had my first baby, and I was on maternity leave. I'm a young mum. I was 21 at the time. We had just bought our first home, and my boyfriend was working ridiculous hours, leaving at around 6:30 AM, and was rarely home before 10:30 PM. On this particular night, he hadn't come home, and it was nearing 11 PM. Sitting with my baby on my lap and my dog Belle, a beautiful Australian shepherd, I heard a knock at the door. This is where I made a big mistake. Holding my newborn, I walked straight up to the door and opened it. I was expecting my boyfriend to be there. Instead, standing there was an older man, in his 50s, balding and average build. He seemed caught off guard and wouldn't stop staring at my baby. He introduced himself as my next door neighbor. This immediately made me feel uncomfortable. We had just moved in, and I met the neighbors on both sides. On either side were young couples buying their first house. There was no older man in either one. I took a step back, and the man started to shift, and randomly started asking me if my TV reception was bad. I'm too nice. I felt alarm bells, but I was too concerned about being polite. At this point, my dog Belle ran up to the door. She ignored the man standing in the door, and looked a bit further down the road, and she started to growl. She never does this. I looked in the direction she was looking at, and I saw the figure of a man hiding behind a tree. I couldn't make anything out since it was so dark outside, but I saw the tip of a cigarette light up when the tree man took a drag. I looked back up at the man at my door, and I put two and two together. I said I didn't know anything about the TV reception, but my boyfriend would, and he was just upstairs. I shut the door, and I locked it. I ran around the house, checking all of the other locks as well. I think I was saved, because this creep had some form of morals, and didn't want to attack a woman holding a newborn baby. They also could have been deterred by my dog. If it wasn't for Belle, I wouldn't have seen the man hiding in the darkness, and I may have continued the conversation, allowing the creep to get over his initial shock.
This happened when I was about 14 or 15 years old. My school has an option. If it's too far for you to travel to school, you can always opt to stay in the hostel. You pay a certain amount of money monthly.
This happened in my junior year of high school. One evening, my mother and stepfather had gone out to some event. Maybe it was an extended dinner. My room. To give you a picture of the room, my desk faces a wall and sits next to a small window that's on the same wall. And from where I sit, my back faces my doorway. While I was working, I was wearing these great headphones that I had gotten for my birthday, the kind that are noise canceling. My parents left the house around 6 p.m., and the whole time they were gone, I sat at my desk, blasting music through my headphones and writing my essay. Occasionally, I would take breaks and watch the rain and lightning outside my window. I never left my desk. My parents returned around 11 p.m., and at some point late in the evening, I had removed my headphones. So when my parents came home, which was coincidentally just a few minutes after I had taken off the headphones, I clearly heard the garage door open, and my parents opened the door to the house. Seconds after I hear them enter, I hear my mother shout my name. "Adrian!" she screams. "What on earth happened in here?" Confused, I get out of my chair and start walking through the house to them. There's only a small hallway that separates my room from the living room. Due to my rush to figure out why my mother was yelling, I paid little attention to the hall and the house. After a few moments, I get to my parents. My mom looks really upset. "Was this you? Did you have friends over?" I look down. The carpet is ruined. It's covered in muddy footprints. I frantically explain to her that I have no idea how those got there, that I had spent the whole night at my desk working on my paper. I watch as her face goes from anger to confusion to fear. We realize that someone else must have entered the house. Quickly, we scan the footprints, trying to make sense of the situation. It only takes us a few moments to figure out where they start. Our back door, which was usually left unlocked. Then we notice something else. The footprints started at the back door, but there were no footprints exiting the back door. We hear something pounding through our house. We hear the front door get torn open and then slammed shut. We all run into the garage and lock the door. My mom starts shouting at the police through the phone. "Please come quickly. Someone has broken into our house." After what seems like hours, the police arrive. An officer stays with us in the garage as his partner goes through the house room by room. His partner tells us that it's safe to go back in, that there's no one in the house. Then she asks us a question. She asks us, whose room is down the hall to the left? My parents look at me, and I tell the officer that it's mine. She asks us to follow her down the hall. As we go, it's easy to see that the footprints weave through my house from the back door. They go through the living room, through the small hallway, into my parents' room, which is down the hall to the right, and then turn around towards my room, and then stop in my doorway. Then the officer points at my door, which I had left open the whole night. On it, in black Sharpie, was written the following: 8:47, I see you. 8:53, you forgot to lock the back door. 8:59, you seem focused. 9:24, turn around. 9:47, look at me. 10:15, look at me. 10:37, look at me. 10:49, look at me. For nearly 2 hours, someone stood in my doorway watching me. To this day, I shudder to think about what would have happened if I had ever turned around and looked at them. I was homeless for a few years after I turned 18. Being homeless leaves you with a permanent feeling of anxiousness and a sliver of fear buried within you at all times. You expect anything. The main problem I had with being homeless was sleeping. I was getting enough money from working side jobs to not have to worry about food or clothes, but finding a suitable place to sleep was difficult. You always had to keep in mind being detected. Sleeping in the woods was uncomfortable, but the odds of a cop waking you up and trespassing you are slim. I drifted around sleeping in unconventional and uncomfortable areas for quite some time, before I discovered an abandoned church off a side road. The church was in pretty good condition, and it was hidden off a side road, so the odds of getting arrested for sleeping there were low. The pews were torn out, and the stained glass windows were murky, with dirt and dust, but there was a roof and 4 walls, and it wasn't infested with animals, so it was heaven. I brought a sleeping bag and some blankets, and I slept there for about a week, while I was trying to save up money to get an apartment for once. After a week of sleeping there, I came back to the church after a day of working and settled down in my sleeping bag, ready to go to sleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a piano. 2 keys being hit repeatedly. My pulse instantly skyrocketed, and I grabbed the knife I kept on me at all times. I didn't even know there was a piano in the church. I slowly got up with the knife in my hand and started packing my things up. I was getting the hell out of there. As I slung my backpack over my shoulder, the sound of the piano cut off and was replaced by the sound of a door creaking open, slowly. I froze again and stared out towards the altar where the sound was coming from. It was dark, and I didn't want to turn on the flashlight on my phone, so I stood there breathing heavily while I was willing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The door behind the altar was swinging open by itself. I tried opening it when I first discovered the church, but it was locked, and I didn't want to break it down. The door was swinging open, and beyond the door was an even pitcher black than the one I was currently experiencing. And I turned towards the main doors, content on getting out before I saw any more. As I turned, I heard the sound of the door swinging open be replaced by the sound of it slamming open violently, and suddenly, a plank of wood fell from the rafters in the ceiling and clattered loudly onto the floor, feet away from me. A groan like a mixture of a machine grinding to a halt and a man in pain emitted from the door behind me that slammed open and sent literal chills up my spine. I slammed my way out of the church and started running up the road. I looked behind me to see the front doors slowly shut by themselves. I never returned. My story may not be the most interesting story you've ever heard. It doesn't end in me seeing a ghost or an alien or anything of that nature. But it is real. Many years ago, I lived in Maine and would occasionally go camping by myself. On one of those occasions, I woke up late in the middle of the night at around 3 a.m. I was tossing and turning and couldn't sleep, so I just lay there listening to the woods. Then I heard a faint hello. I was petrified. I felt so vulnerable in that tent. I never figured out who it was. The summer after I graduated from high school, I left work early and went up to my parents' cabin in northern Michigan. I spent the night at the beach, watching the sunset. Once the sun went down and it became nearly pitch black, I got to my car and started driving down the highway. After a minute, there was an old Tahoe that started riding my tail and flashing its high beams. So I got up to about 60 in a 45, and they were still on my tail. I pulled off to the side road that my parents' cabin is off of, and they took the same turn. I thought this seemed weird, because there's only about 30 or 40 houses on this road. So I went all the way to the end, which is usually a dead end, but leads to a maintenance area for the golf course nearby. The truck was still following me. At this point, I was freaking out, because if I pulled into the house, they would know where we lived, and they were still very close behind me. I took a bunch of random turns, and the truck kept following every single turn for about 15 minutes. I finally had a chance to make a turn with traffic, going through the intersection that gave me a few seconds of a head start. I pulled down a side street. I went up about 100 yards and then turned off all my lights and waited. The truck slowly drove by the perpendicular street and kept going. I booked it home, pulled my car around the side away from the main road, and pulled every curtain in the cabin. For an 18-year-old, I was scared as hell that night. Years ago, in the early 90s, my boyfriend was driving me home, and we saw a man lying on the ground in the strangest position, kneeling with his head on the ground and bent at a sharp angle so that he faced the street. It was 2 in the morning, and the man was covered in sweat, with his eyes open. We pulled over, and I hopped out of the car to check on this guy. His eyes were wide open, and he seemed like his face wasn't moving, but it really felt like he was pleading for help. He didn't respond at all when called out to him. No blinking. He had glassy eyes. I reached out to touch him, and he was ice cold. I'm sure he wasn't breathing. This was before cell phones, so I hopped back in the car and we sped back to my house to call 911. 10 minutes later, the police called back to ask for the cross streets again. Apparently, they arrived at the corner and there was nothing there. I verified that they had the right spot, and they said they would call back if they needed any more information. That was the last I ever heard about it. I checked the newspaper for the next few weeks, but we never found out anything else about that man in the road.
Narrator narrates all. Narrator off.
This is a story that was told to me by my mother. She was home alone and was expecting a friend to come over. She wanted to take a shower, so she left a note on the front door that said, "I'm in the shower, come on in." While she was showering, she heard a knock on the bathroom door, and she said, "I'll be right out." When she got out of the shower, nobody was there, and a few minutes later, her friend pulled into the driveway. I often visit Walmart in the wee hours of the morning. One time, I was in at about 2 a.m. and noticed an elderly gentleman asleep on one of those mobility scooters at the entrance. When I left about 20 minutes later, he was still there. I thought it was a little odd that no one from the store had woken him up. I found out the next day that he had died and spent the better part of a day on display as a corpse at the entrance to Walmart. I'm a massage therapist. I work for myself and frequently go to clients' homes at night. Whenever I would have a new client, I would bring my boyfriend with me as kind of backup. So the new client's condo was in a really nice area in Arizona. It was around 8 p.m. when I arrived. I got out of the truck and grabbed my bag and started looking for the apartment, because this was one of those mega complexes, and of course, the numbers were barely visible. As I was walking around, I noticed that every light I walked by would start flickering really quickly. Like the light would be fine 1 minute, and as soon as I walked by it, it would start flickering. I felt like someone was watching me, but I shrugged it off and found the condo as quickly as possible. My session lasted about 90 minutes, and I packed up and headed back to the truck. Except it wasn't in the spot that my boyfriend had parked in previously. So I call him, and he says that he's on his way, that something happened. I get in the truck when he arrives, and he is super pale, and his hands are shaking. I ask him what happened. He told me that as I was walking towards the apartments from the parking lot, he saw a girl behind me, walking in tandem with me, almost like a shadow. He said he put his head down to light a cigarette, and neither one of us were in his line of vision anymore. About halfway through his cigarette, he saw someone walk by the truck really quickly through the rearview mirror. He said it was the same girl. He was starting to feel a little freaked out, but nothing too bad. He said he turned on his headphones and leaned the seat back to take a nap, I guess, when he felt a thumping under his feet on the floorboard. He said he looked out into the parking lot and then saw the girl crawl out from under the hood of the truck, stand up, and then walk backwards away, looking at him the whole time, and then disappeared into the shadows of the opposite side of the parking lot awnings. So he peeled out and sat at the nearest gas station, which was right next door, for the rest of my appointment. I never went back to that particular client's home after that. A few years ago, I was awoken in the middle of the night by a phone call. I answered the phone, and I heard a woman's voice on the other end, crying, and then she whispered, "Help me." I looked at the screen, and the number was restricted. I heard more crying, and then a sudden scream. The scream was cut short, and the line disconnected. I've told this story to many people, and most of them say it was probably a prank call. I would have agreed, but the crying, it sounded so desperate, so real. I have no idea who it was. When I was a teen, I never had much of a rebellious side, but my parents didn't want me in their bathroom when they weren't home. They had a fantastic shower as compared to the leaky piece of crap that I was stuck with. We'd had a minor spat this particular morning, and they left to quote-unquote clear their heads. That meant it was time to use the fancy shower. I was alone, and they had been gone about a half an hour. Then, I suddenly hear my dad stomp into the bedroom. He slammed his keys down, checked the answering machine, and I knew that he had to have been pissed, so I called out, "My shower drain was leaking again, I'm sorry, I'll be out in a minute." And then, I heard him stomp over to the bathroom door, and then stop. I called out to him, and he starts jiggling and turning the handle like crazy. The weird thing is, the door wasn't locked. So I stepped out of the shower quickly and wrapped a towel around me and began saying, "What the hell?" as I opened the door. I opened it while it was in mid-shake, watching the knob turn, and there was no one on the other side when the door opened. I ran through the apartment and saw that we still had a message on the machine, and the front door was still locked. My parents came home 2 hours later. I took in a puppy a few months ago. Her original owners weren't able to bond with her. They said that she was unresponsive and disobedient and didn't have the look that they wanted. I have no idea what they were talking about. She's the best behaved dog that I've ever known, and she's downright adorable. So I'm used to people stopping me in the street so they can pet her. Usually, people will ask before they touch her, or at the very least, they'll say something like, "Oh my gosh, look at that dog," to let me know that they're obviously gonna come over and say hi to her. I'm pretty much fine with that. What I'm not fine with is what happened on one of my earlier walks with her. I live in a tiny seaside town, and I like to take my dog on a tour of all the areas closest to the sea when I walk her. We'll walk along the beach, down the promenade, around the miniature lakes, and then back home. Probably not the smartest thing to do, the same route every day, but I've switched things up since this happened. We were at the final stage of our walk one evening, making a couple laps around the lakes, when we walked past a man. Now, a lot of old men gather there on a regular basis. I didn't think much of one dude sitting on a bench by the water. I told myself he was staring because my dog was cute. I just passed him by. Then, from behind me, I hear him say, "Sit." And my dog, who is much more obedient than her previous owners let on, sits down and looks up at me all happy and expecting a treat. I turn around and frown back at the guy, and I see that he's still seated on the bench, and quickly encourage my puppy to start walking again. We haven't gotten 5 feet further down the path before behind me I hear, "Sit," and my dog does. I turn around again, already glaring, and see that the man is now on his feet. I tell my dog to keep walking and try to get her to pick up the pace, trying to get over to the path that leads up to the main street. We're still nowhere near the path when the man yells, "Sit," and my dog does again. She's starting to look very confused, and I'm pretty much terrified at this point. He's coming over to us, and he's catching up fairly quickly. He's close enough that even without my glasses, I can tell that he's grinning. At that point, I had had enough. I forgot about getting to the path. I just scooped up my dog off the ground and ran straight up the hill to the side of us, and climbed over the little fence that separates the lakes from the street. I looked down. The man didn't follow, but stayed at the bottom of the hill, looking up at us. He was not smiling anymore. I had never seen him before, and haven't seen him since, and I really hope that it stays that way. I don't know exactly what his intentions were, but it seemed to me like he was using my dog's obedience to slow me down, to keep me from getting away from him. So I really doubt his intentions were good. I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. A few winters ago, I got a job as a security guard. My responsibilities were to guard the construction site of a 3-story industrial building that was in development. This was a super sweet job. All I had to do was be at the construction site between the hours of 7 p.m. and 3 a.m. I could sit in my truck the entire time, except for 2 different times that I was instructed to patrol the site. What I would do is get out of my truck and walk the perimeter of this site, and then go inside and shine my flashlight around. This obviously wasn't a hard task, but it was a bit creepy. It was pitch black around this site at night, and there were no working lights anywhere. Every time I patrolled, I was a bit creeped out, except for one evening, where the creepiness turned into straight up terror. The night was going by normally. I was watching YouTube videos and listening to music in my truck. The clock hit 1 a.m. and I was due to complete my second patrol through the site. The first patrol went by completely normal, and I had no reason to expect any different this time around. So I jumped out of the truck and started down the path that led around the site. I was shining my flashlight in front of me the whole time and saw nothing out of the ordinary. This trek around the site took the most time out of the patrol, and I'd say about 15 minutes after I began, I had circled all the way around and was back at my truck. At this time, I headed inside the building. My truck was parked in front of the building, and so I entered at the front door. The building was still being framed, and there were no doors installed anywhere, including the ones that led to the exterior. And that's the reason I was here, to make sure that nobody walked inside and stole any equipment or vandalized any part of it. As I walked inside, I heard something upstairs. It sounded like a shovel or something had fallen onto the floor, and so I hesitantly started up the stairs to investigate. I was a little bit spooked. What would I do if there was somebody up here messing around? I didn't have a gun or anything, just some pepper spray that the owners gave me. I reached the top of the stairs on the second floor, and I shined my flashlight around and didn't see anything suspicious. I walked around and eventually reached the front of the building, and that's when I looked down to my truck through the recently installed window. There was somebody sitting in my truck. He was sitting on the driver's side seat with his legs still hanging out of the truck facing me. I was just about to turn around and head back down to confront him when he suddenly looked up at me and waved. At that moment, I turned around and ran back to the stairs. I walked down them quickly and ran out of the building. I ran over to my truck, and the guy was no longer there. I got very nervous at this point and looked around with my flashlight. I saw nothing and decided to call my boss and let him know that there was a man here. As the phone was ringing, I searched my truck and saw that nothing was missing and everything was where I left it. My boss didn't answer, and so I left a very short message stating, "It's 1:22 a.m. and there is someone messing around the site, and I have not located him yet." I shined my light around like a madman searching for this potentially dangerous person, and thought it would be a better idea to get in my truck and drive slowly around the site. This didn't take long, and I didn't see anyone. I circled back to the front and parked my truck in the same exact spot that I was in before. I put the truck in park and called my boss again. I got no answer and got out of the truck once again. I stood next to my driver's side door and again shined the light around. I didn't see anyone. Then I shined the light up to the window that I had been at when I first noticed him and saw him standing in the same spot I was at, looking down at me. I realized my job was to stop people from messing around at this site, but this creeped me out so much. I got in my truck and waited until my boss eventually called back. He called the police, and an officer showed up there about an hour later. He went inside the building and looked around, but never found the guy. I didn't see him again that night, or any other night I was there. I have no idea who he was or why he was there. I left work late one night, later than usual. I was driving home when I unexpectedly ran into some construction going on, and I was forced to take a detour. I turned right onto a street I rarely ever drove on and haven't been on in years. The street took me into the downtown area of my city, and it wasn't a very nice place to be. Crime happened here all the time, and it made me nervous, especially because it was late and there were no other vehicles around. I stopped at a stop sign and apparently made a wrong turn because I looked around and noticed the detour signs were gone. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket sitting on the passenger seat in order to use GPS so I didn't get too lost, and to guide me home. As I was navigating my phone, I heard a noise outside. I looked up from my phone to see what it was. As I looked around, I spotted a woman about 30 yards from my car. in the parking lot of a convenience store that was now closed. She was standing off by the corner of the store where it was much darker. Right after I saw her, I noticed that she looked scared, and then almost immediately I saw a man reach out from the side of the building she was standing next to, grab her by the arm, and pull her out of sight. The woman had made a noise again. This scared me to death, and I wasn't sure what to do. My first thought was that he might have been trying to rob her. I was about to dial 911 on my cell phone when I realized he might be trying to do something worse. I'm not the toughest guy in the world, and I've only been in a couple fights in my life, but I'll be damned if this woman was going to be raped or killed while I was right here. So I take a deep breath and opened my car door. After I did this, I heard the woman again. It sounded like she was half screaming, half calling for help, but all her noise sounded muffled, like the man was covering her mouth. I walked around to the back of my car and started towards where she had disappeared out of sight. I walked fast, but tried to be as silent as possible. As I walked, her sounds were abruptly cut off, and I got scared. Scared of what I might see. Scared of what I might have to do. I reached the corner of the store and very slowly looked down into the dark side of the building. At first, I saw nothing, and so I moved closer. And that's when I saw them. I saw them both standing in the darkness, side by side, like statues. He wasn't touching her. She wasn't crying or screaming. And they weren't fighting. I realized quickly what was happening now. I immediately turned around and started a sprint back towards my car. As my feet hit the ground, I could hear that they were chasing me. I got to my car and threw the door open and got inside. I locked the door, and right after I did, they were both attempting to open the doors from both sides. I put my key in the ignition, started it, and stomped the pedal to the floor. I was so shaken up over what had just happened that I ran 2 stop signs right after. I drove home and never saw their faces up close. And you bet your ass I haven't been down that street since. I know someone from my childhood who used to work as a chef. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah had to prepare a dinner party for a politician, but she and her workmates had run out of some ingredients, and since she drove a motorcycle, she offered to rush to a nearby store that was a few miles away. The house they were working for was settled on a hill. Aside from a few houses, there weren't any stores or establishments in the area. The road was empty. There was no one around. Sarah finished the errand and began to drive back. She was halfway on her journey when she felt a weight push against her back. Startled, she glanced at her rearview mirror and saw an unfamiliar woman with matted hair sitting in the back of her motorcycle, smiling and staring directly at her. Sarah was so shocked, she nearly lost control of her motorcycle. She concentrated as hard as she could and revved the accelerator as fast as it would go. She began cursing at the woman, telling her to get off the bike. As soon as Sarah could see the house in the distance, she heard the woman laugh, and suddenly her motorcycle felt lighter. She couldn't feel anything pressing up against her anymore. She dared to glance at her rearview mirror again, and thankfully, she saw no one. When she arrived at the house, she was trembling. She knew that she would sound delusional and possibly even gain a bad reputation at her job, but she told the people there about what she saw, and to her astonishment, a couple of the politician's security guards chuckled and told her that this was normal around here. Apparently, a few other motorists living in the area also endured the same encounter. My husband and I lived in a small 2-floor house with 2 main entrances, one along the front and the other on the side of the house, which opens up into the laundry room. When we were too busy or it's too late to walk our dog, we hook his collar onto a long line that's attached to one of the pipes on the corner of our house.
All night, climbing down the mountain and letting out the most horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log. She was missing her shoes and her backpack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to the base. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to the base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She said she wasn't going to go with him, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't know how to describe it. When we were within sight of base, the woman turns to me and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human being can open them. She touches my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say I was really happy when we left that area that night. Alright, this is the last one I'll tell for now, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every search and rescue unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other search and rescue officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point, we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles, at some point, we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it and that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very seriously that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. I have a lot more stories, and I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell some of them tomorrow. If anyone has any theories about the stairs, or if you've seen them too, let me know. So I logged back on tonight and was blown away by the staggering amount of interest this seems to have generated. First off, I'll address a few things that you guys have brought up. There's been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarity between some of my stories and those of David Paulide's. I assure you I'm not trying to rip him off to write the strange, or we find them in places they have no business being in. I personally haven't been on many calls like that, and all others were metal. risky as anything. A few people expressed confusion about the guy who ran into the man with no face. Just to clarify, when the climber ascended and reached the top of this peak, he saw another man in a parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face. Sorry about the confusing wording of that story. I'll try to avoid that in the future. Alright, now on to the news stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls, people who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens, mostly drunk kids. Get bitten or stung by animals or insects. We're a tight team and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing because past a certain point, it really doesn't matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in our standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes over the radio telling us to all head back to the vet's location and we have to come right away, because this usually means the missing person is injured and we need a full team to help get them to safety. We meet back up and the vet is just standing at the base of the tree with his hands on the side of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on and he points up into the branches of the tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there's a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle has been looped around the branch and it's just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any signs that he's still in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring our canines out, but they lose his scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search is called off because there are other calls we have to attend to, and past a certain point there's not much we can do. The guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we'd found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That, and the questions that were raised. How the hell did this guy's cane end up there? Did someone kill him and toss that up there as some weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what the circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy, and we always dread the ones that we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. David Paulides talks a lot about kids search and rescue teams find in places that they shouldn't be, or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones that I think about a lot that I witnessed personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other's about 3. She's watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs their stuff up and they start to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost from the parking area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her when she hears what sounds like someone coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 or so seconds she's not looking, her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figures he's stepped off the trail to go pee or something, and she asks her 2 other kids where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the woods. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it seems like they've been drugged. They're sort of spacey and fuzzy. So of course, she freaks out, starts frantically looking around the area for her kid. She's screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer her. Now, obviously she can't go blindly running into the woods, she's got the other 2 kids, so she calls the police and sends us out immediately. We respond and we start the search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. The canines can't pick up any scent, we don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being out there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We look for this kid for weeks with a lot of volunteer help, but eventually the search peters out and we had to move on. The volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us the location and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there, about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured he might as well look in places no one else would think to on the off chance the body had been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed in a little opening in the rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in, and we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. This slope is treacherous, and it's hard for even us to climb on it with our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there, of that I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty, so it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what I can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for, at most, a day or 2. The whole thing was unbelievably strange and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death. Probably late at night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he'd been last seen. The kid wasn't even aware that he'd wandered off that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm not really good with kids, and I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out there, it's a few miles away, and we get there in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, and she's pointing out places she's found people in the past, I see something in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on state protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing is has straight edges. And if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I pointed out, but
a tremendous bang from upstairs, then another. Then it was like someone was jumping up and down. Then footsteps, heavy footsteps. Then the footsteps are running. Now, this house is at least 200 to 250 years old, and it's more of a mansion to be honest. The current owners are extremely wealthy. V tells me that the owners had done some extensive renovations, and following this, she had begun to hear noises. Small things though, nothing like this. Well, my first thoughts weren't anything necessarily paranormal. I'm pretty much a skeptic when it comes to all that, even though I've had one or two more strange experiences beside this one. My first thought is that someone is actually in the house, realized V and the kids were home, and begun rushing around upstairs to locate an exit. I wasn't jumping to fucking ghost man just yet. So having had plenty of CQB experience while in Afghanistan, I was not about to clear such a huge house on my own, blind spots galore. I secure the family in my cruiser and go to the side of the house, where, luckily, I'm able to cover both the front and rear of the house, and one side of it, so 3/4 of the exit are covered. I'm the only officer on shift at the time, so dispatch has to request an officer from a town we have a mutual aid policy with. He's on a back road that connects directly to the town I'm in, so he gets there in 5 minutes. He arrives with his field training officer, FTO. He was still new enough to be riding with.
Number 6.
I'm a male, 23 years old, and live in a small town in Norway. My English may be off at some points due to not being my main language. At the time of this story, it was summer, and I decided to travel back home to my parents as the university I was studying at gave us a pretty long summer break. I was excited to see my family again as I hadn't seen them since Christmas, and even though the train journey took about 9 hours, I enjoyed the trip thanks to my brilliant playlist on Spotify. It had been 3 years since I lived with my parents, and I loved living alone, but thankfully they had a basement, which was basically an apartment. I had my own bathroom, living room, and kitchen. You can't get to the upper floor of the house without going outside, walking up some stairs and enter the main entrance to the second floor. And vice versa, my parents couldn't enter the basement without going outside, down the stairs and in through the front door. This is quite important. So the basement is pretty much secluded from the rest of the house, and you feel that it really is its own apartment. So I got home, and before I even got through the door, my mum welcomed me and told me that she was happy I managed to get home before she and my dad left for their trip. Shit, I totally forgot. My parents were going to Spain for 2 weeks on vacation with my grandmother. I had nothing against being alone in the house though, and I knew it was the perfect opportunity to invite some friends and host a little party. So the first night went absolutely fine. I slept like a baby and even woke up early enough to drive my parents to the airport. Wishing them a safe trip, I headed back home from dropping them off. I spent the entire day on the computer playing Counter-Strike with my friends. I had brought my PC from uni and it was a solid gaming laptop. Now, to help you understand a little better, I'll explain the layout of the apartment. Once you enter, there's a long hallway, and if you go straight forward, you get to my bedroom, which means you can lie in my bed and watch the entrance door. The bathroom is to the right in the long hallway before the bedroom, while the living room is to the left. The entrance to the living room was basically right next to the bedroom. So I was sitting in the living room playing on my computer before I realized that it was dark outside. I had been playing the entire day and now I started to feel tired. I headed to my bedroom and fell asleep almost instantly. Suddenly though, I wake up after hearing a noise I still can't explain. It was so clear, but yet so hard to describe. Imagine the sound coming from a light bulb hit with a needle. It was that clear sound of metal on glass. It sounded like the noise came from my bedroom, right next to my ear to be honest. It was so clear, and it instantly woke me up. I turned on the light in my bedroom and looked around for what could have caused the strange sound. I was home alone, and we didn't have any pets, and the closest neighbours lived about 1 kilometre away. I should also probably mention that it was 2:30 AM. I couldn't see anything or anyone who could have caused the sound, but to my surprise, the entrance to the door to the apartment was open. At first, this made me a little bit anxious, but then I realised that I had had it open the entire day. It was open because it got so hot earlier on while I was playing on the computer. Despite it being Norway, our summers are usually warm, and I must have just forgotten to close and lock the door before I fell asleep. I sighed in relief as I started to walk towards the door to close it before going back to sleep. As I passed the entrance to the living room, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. Just as I passed the living room, music starts playing loudly from inside it. It was so loud that I was sure the entire town could hear it. I had my PC hooked up to some speakers, but I never had them turn that loud. And how did the music just randomly start on its own at that exact point? It was a woman that sung opera in a high-pitched tone. I had never heard the song before, and I for sure didn't have it on any of my playlists. The title was Secret Garden, and to my surprise, the music wasn't being played from Spotify, but from YouTube. What the fuck? How was that possible? Had someone noticed the open door, snuck their way past my bedroom, opened my PC and decided that it was a good idea to turn on some opera music on YouTube? I didn't understand any of this, but I quickly exited the browser, killing the loud music. I then walked through the long hallway and closed the entrance door. I turned on all the lights and searched every room in the basement, and as I'm sure you're aware, I didn't find anyone or anything. I even looked for footprints in the hallways. It had a white carpet, which shows tracks easily. I don't know how to explain this. I can still remember that sound that woke me up so clearly, like soft chimes from metal on glass. I also figured that it couldn't have been some intruder who entered the apartment and decided to use my PC to play some music from YouTube, because the music started just as I walked by the living room and there was nobody there. And before you comment that someone hacked me or used TeamViewer or something, there's no way. I have worked in IT for 2 years and know my way around a computer. I didn't have any viruses or any software installed to let someone external take control of my computer. And that still wouldn't explain the noise that woke me up, which I know didn't come from my computer. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but this experience made me think about it. I'm not religious, and I would very much say I'm a man of science. I study psychology, and I am aware of the ways our brains can fool us into thinking we hear something or see something that isn't real. But this wasn't like that. The sound that woke me up was so clear, and I was wide awake when I heard those 3 chimes. I don't really know how to explain the music that suddenly started to blast as I walked past the entrance to the living room. I never heard or experienced anything like this after that. My mum constantly complains about the light bulbs dying in the basement, even though she just changed them. This only happens in the basement, and I'm sure there is a logical reason, but I dare you to explain my own experience.
Number 5.
It all started around July of 2016. I was having a sleepover with my friend on a Friday night. We'll call my friend Jay for privacy reasons. Jay had around 15 acres of land, 4 acres of that being a forest. We like to set up our tents in his forest and go camping there sometimes, so we set up our tent under a giant tree. This particular tree had weird dream catchers on it. No one knew how they got there or why they were there, not even his family. It was around 12:30 when we decided to walk up their driveway, so we gathered our flashlights and headed over. Once we got there, we started to walk the driveway, and we got this weird feeling in our stomachs, and it just got stronger and stronger the more we walked. Our flashlights also started to flicker and went out at the end of the driveway, so we decided to just go back to the tent. Once we got back, however, we noticed something a little odd. We put our backpacks back into our tent and decided to walk around the tent. What we found, I'll never forget. There was glass and string on the ground, and When we looked up, there were no dream catchers left. They were on the ground, all crushed. We just assumed it was the wind and went back into the tent. It was now around 2:30 a.m, so we decided we should head to bed. As we were falling asleep, we could hear leaves crunching. I assumed it was Jay's dad because he liked to scare us. But when Jay yelled out, "Dad, we know it's you. You can go get a life now," we heard no response. So we thought it was an animal. But as we listened, we could tell that this thing only had 2 legs. The walking continued for an hour and a half, walking around our tent. I looked out when I had had enough, and when I decided to look out the tent window, I could hear footsteps near the door. However, when I peeked out the window, there was nothing there. No trace of anything or anyone. And when I laid back down, there were no sounds. Nothing. The next morning, we went up to Jay's dad, and Jay told him, "Nice try scaring us last night." I then also said, "Why were you even out there for that long?" I paused to see a confused look on Jay's dad's face. I continued, "You were out there for an hour and a half, for crying out loud." When Jay's dad had a chance to speak, he said, "What do you mean? I was sleeping all night. I wouldn't go out for that long." At this point, Jay had a worried look on his face. So did I. Unfortunately, I had to leave his house before we could figure anything out. It was around a month later. Jay and I had forgotten everything that had happened. We were having another sleepover, and at the time, I had a cast on my foot, so we couldn't do much. I was using my crutches instead of my wheelchair because it was too much of a hassle to bring it over. It was a Friday night. Once again, it was 12:30 in the morning. We were bored, and Jay's parents said that we couldn't go outside, but we decided to sneak out anyway. This was a hard task with my crutches and my cast, but somehow we did it without being caught. Again, we started to walk up the driveway. We were talking about stuff normal teens do, but as we walked further down, we got that weird feeling in our stomachs again. When this happened, I immediately remembered what happened the night of the dream catchers. We heard a loud bang from the end of the driveway, so we looked in panic, and we saw what looked like 3 eyes. I felt like I couldn't move. I was just standing there. Jay was yelling at me that we had to go back. Then I realized what had happened and snapped out of it and went back to the house. Nothing else happened that night. We decided to have another sleepover on September 16th of 2016. This was the day that I got my cast off, so it was perfect. Although my muscles were weak, I could barely walk, so I suffered through it. This night, we were prepared for this thing. We set up our tent back in the woods, but this night, nothing really weird happened. It was now October 8th of 2016. Jay, one of Jay's friends who we'll call Will, and I were hanging out together. We did some fun stuff like eat 10 warheads at once. After some fun, and as night was setting in, we were talking and then heard some rattling in his barn. It kind of sounded like a door shutting or something. We went silent before we walked up to the barn, and I got a knife out and ready while Will and Jay followed behind me. His barn was 2 stories high. We were in the top floor earlier in the day, and when we came down, we made sure to close up the door to the stairwell. When we got in, we noticed 2 things. The first thing was that the door to the stairwell was open, and the second was that we heard footsteps on the floor to the upstairs. So I walked into the stairwell and led the way up the stairs, step by step. When we got up there was no one up there. I looked into his yard and I saw something white. I blinked and it moved. I looked one more time, but it was gone. I told them what I saw and we headed that way. By now, Will was begging for us to go back to the house, but we refused. Then Jay yelled out, "Run!" So we ran back. I asked what the hell he saw and he responded with, It was something in a white outfit, glowing white, with 3 eyes. I got a worried look on my face. Will asked what the hell was going on, and we explained everything, and he freaked out and left Jay's house. Now, I wish I could say that this was the end, but it's not. We had a sleepover at my house on October 22nd of 2016. Nothing weird happened that night, but it seemed to have started something. Every night since then, Jay and I have been hearing screaming when our family can't. The latest things that have happened have been destructive. At Jay's house, he saw a white figure near his barn. He blinked and it was gone, and one of his sheep laid on the ground dead. On October 27th of 2016, I was drinking a can of Dr. Pepper and I left to go get something. When I came back, the can was upside down and the pop was spilled all over my desk. Luckily, it didn't go on my computer. I have no idea what's going on.
Number 4.
I live in Canada, near the escarpment, which is a mountainous area full of trees. Beside the escarpment are large fields of farms. My uncle worked at one of these farms. One summer, when I was 9 years old, he took my 3 cousins and me to work with him, with the permission of his employer. We were allowed to play, but we were told not to go towards the sparse forest that went down the land from the mountains to the road. We were also told not to go along the road to the other side of the forest because there was an abandoned barn there, according to my uncle. After this little pep talk, they all set off to work and we played in the cornfields. We were playing hide and seek, but as we played, we slowly crept closer and closer to the forest, and eventually, the game ended up in the forest. By the time we were playing in the forest, it was already late afternoon. Once it was my turn to hide, I ran off far to the end of the forest. I was greeted by a large barn that was a faded red. Its roof had collapsed and it had holes in its walls. Being the smartass I thought I'd hide in the barn, knowing that it would be the perfect hiding spot. In my mind, I was thinking of bragging about being brave and cool as I went to the back of the barn, into a stable and sat in the corner. It had a weird smell, but I ignored it. The smell could be endured for victory's sake. Being narcoleptic, I fall asleep in comfortable environments very easily, and at the time, the barn was very comfortable. When I woke up, it was completely dark. I figured my cousins couldn't find me and had given up. I felt some disappointment that they couldn't find me in my awesome hiding spot. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed that I wasn't alone. Right in front of me, across to the other side of the wall, was a man, just sitting there, staring at me. I remember he looked young but extremely tired. I was frightened because I felt something off about him. I almost even screamed, but nothing came out though. I took deep breaths and mentally prepared myself for anything. I did Taekwondo, so I was confident that I could hurt him enough to run off at least. But all that confidence faded to dust when he stood up. I forgot every single thing that I learned. He staggered a bit, losing his footing as he walked. In the rush of the moment, I started to kick both of my feet against the wall of the barn with all the strength of my legs, and actually broke through. He bolted towards me, and I jumped through the hole, breaking it completely open as I went through quickly. And I ran, and I didn't look back. I ran to the road, and then following the side of the road, I ran along the edge of the forest and straight to the cornfields. I thought he wouldn't be able to find me in the cornfields if he was behind me. I just kept running straight until I saw lights piercing through the cornfields like blinds. I followed it, and I found the farmhouse. The first person I saw was my mother, and I didn't stop running until I ran into her arms. Finally, to safety. It took a moment for me to realize that there were 2 police officers there. When my mother put me down on a chair, she screamed, noticing my injuries, which up until this point, I didn't notice at all. I had a large piece of wood piercing the loose flesh of my leg. I was severely bruised and scraped all over, bleeding profusely. Until it was pointed out, I strangely did not feel any pain at all. But once I did, I started to cry. They told me the ambulance was coming, and the police tried to get me to talk in the meanwhile. And I told him, while stuttering and fighting my tears, I told him I was in an abandoned barn, and there was a man that attacked me. I gave them details of whatever I could remember of the man, and I remembered him very well. The police went to check the barn, and when they came back, they seemed to be shaken and unusually quiet. The 2 policemen just looked at each other, and then called my parents aside to talk to them. They talked for a while. The ambulance finally arrived, and my parents came back to me as they pulled me out to the stretcher. They seemed almost frightened and shocked. I was taken away to the hospital. Once I was released and we went home, my parents never let me bring it up again. Not that I was completely willing to anyway, but it always stuck at the back of my mind. What did they find? Did the men escape? Why did they look so disturbed? A couple of years later, I asked my mother what the police officer had told her back then at the farm. My mother stared at me for a bit, as if she was deciding whether or not she should tell me. She parted her lips for a moment before speaking. The police told us that the man you described was found in the barn, at the back, leaning against the wall. She paused for a while. I simply thought about it during that long moment. The man must have backed off once I escaped. Dead, she blurted out, interrupting my thoughts. I felt my heart sink and my stomach twist. The police said that he must have been dead for at least a couple of weeks. I am now almost 18, and to this day, I don't know what I saw. Was it my imagination, or something else?
Number 3.
This happened to me in a campsite in Kentucky with my dad. We lived in a small town that you could blink and miss. In fact, it wasn't really a town at all. It just had some hollows, which is what we call streets that are nestled in between the mountains. We lived in a family holler called Grim Holler. I know, spooky, right? But it was honestly my grandmother's maiden name. We lived in a trailer, and our closest neighbour, my Uncle Bob, lived about 1.5 miles up the road. My grandmother had lived in Kentucky her whole life, born and raised, and a few years ago died. I moved there when I was 11, from Iowa. I lived there with my dad and her. She only had one leg due to diabetes, so I used to take her wheelchair to be a jerk. But to be honest, even in her old age, she got around just fine without it. But that sure didn't stop her from yelling at me. She was an old gypsy kind of woman, very superstitious. She used to tell me about how, when walking with someone down the street, never to let a pole come between you because it hurts your connection with that person. Even now, as a grown 24-year-old woman with no religious views, I find myself doing a lot of the stuff that she told me not to do. About a year ago, I came across a creepypasta that chilled me to the bones, something I hadn't put a lot of thought into, even when it happened. I'm sure you know it, the Goat Man. One night, my older cousin was telling me about some of the folklore Grams used to tell him. One of them being about this thing that lived in the woods that would trick you into following it so deep into the woods that you would get lost and never be found. And immediately, Grams gets very, very mad. She went off on a rant about how if you talk about it, it comes, and it's bad luck to even talk about it. Seeing how much this freaks her out, I press on just to mess with her. But I suddenly want to know all about this thing in the woods. Unfortunately though, she went on to never talk about it again, but my cousin told me the rest of the story later that night. A few days pass and I don't think about it a lot. I was more worried about bobcats than a made-up superstition about a goat monster in the woods. The property that we lived on was huge, and my dad had mowed this tall grass area so that we could have a campsite. We're out there, maybe 1/4 mile from the trailer, but with how tall the grass was, you couldn't see it or anything around it. It had just gotten dark and we were cooking corn and hot dogs, and my dad went back up to the trailer to grab some buns. I never liked the dark, and with how much wildlife is in Kentucky, I was super pumped about being left there. After a little bit, I was hearing this gritting sound, like what someone makes when they're mumbling under their voice. Then I see the tall grass move just in front of me, but it was so dark that I couldn't see what was causing it. I kept telling myself it was rabbits. They're all over, so it must have been one. That was until the noise was just on the edge of the grass. There was this smell, this awful metal smell. It was like when my dad tossed beer cans into the fire. It was so strong, and the grass was moving more. I noticed something really weird too. It was like mid-August, and I couldn't hear anything other than the grass moving. No wind, no bugs or birds, nothing but the grass rustling. Then I saw my dad coming up the little trail. If it wasn't for me being frozen scared, I would have gotten up and hugged him.
But immediately he was mad at me, thinking that I tossed empty cans into the fire, which, being 11 at the time, I wasn't allowed to do. I tried to tell him that it wasn't me and that the smell had come out of nowhere. We were considering camping out there, but Graham said that we shouldn't camp out because the news said it was going to rain. So my dad dumped some water on the fire and we packed up, leaving the little tent. That night, there was a massive thunderstorm. The best thing about Kentucky thunderstorms is that when you're in the holler and surrounded by trees with no streetlights, and it's blackout and the lightning hits, it's like the middle of the day for like a good 2 to 3 seconds. You can only see past the first 2 tree lines depending on how bright the lightning is, but everything past that was still ink black. From my porch to the street that ran in front of my trailer was maybe 10 yards, then the tree line was pressed right against the other side of the road. I was sitting on the porch watching the storm, which I had done a few times before. I was still a little nervous about the grass. When the lightning hits, everything in our front yard to the second tree line is bright as day, and the second time is when I saw it. Standing behind the first tree line, there was something standing in the woods with their back to the house. Then it was pitch black again. I sit there, waiting for it to happen again, and that's when I smell it, that smell again, that awful blood and metal smell. Then the lightning and thunder hits again, and it was standing closer to the first set of trees. I was really confused and a little freaked out. Then it hit again. I thought for sure that it was going to be in my yard, just looking at me, but when I quickly scanned the woods, I saw it was gone. So I go into the trailer, not wanting to see where this weird person was going to pop up next, and I'm standing in the doorway in the kitchen where my grandmother is standing at the sink doing dishes. She looks at me and asks me why I'm not out watching the storm. I tell her that there's this weird person standing in the woods with their back to me. She looks at me, and in a split second, with one leg mind you, my Grams rushes to the back door and locks it, then past my dad on the couch and locks the front door. She tells my dad to lock the windows. He grumbles at first, but after a few choice words from Grams, gets up and does what he's told. She then took me into her room and shut the door and made me tell her everything. I tell her about the tall grass and the metal smell and how it came back when I was on the porch. I stayed in her room that night, and when I had to go to school on that Monday in the early morning when it was still dark, she made my dad stand out with me. We didn't camp out after that because the next morning the tent was destroyed. It looked like someone took scissors and ripped holes all over. My dad just chalked it up to the storm, but when my Uncle Bob found the tent zipper in his yard, my dad got a little freaked out. After finally reading up about the goat man, I can't tell you how I felt. Like I was so close to this thing. It was lurking in the grass, just a few feet from me. I wish my Grams was still here and I could tell her I believed her and I was sorry for making fun of her. So if you're ever in Whittinsville, Kentucky, please watch out.
Number 2.
I'm a senior in high school, and right now my class schedule is a mix of some AP classes and some easier electives. In my electives, there's usually a collective mix of people from all different grades, so I don't know a lot of the kids in my classes. There's one class in particular that I have with my best friend. The teacher is wonderful, the course load isn't too demanding, and it's an all-around fun class. That is, unless you count the kid I have to sit next to. We'll call this kid Brian. I knew on the first day of class that I did not like Brian. He interjects into class conversation in places where it's not needed, and with some really shitty jokes that he seems to think are hilarious. He's also the type of person who will repeat what he said over and over if he thinks everyone is ignoring him as a sign that they just didn't hear him. Now, you may be thinking that he has some sort of disability, but I can promise you he doesn't. I'm no expert, but just knowing this kid, I can almost guarantee his only problem is impulse control. I was getting an A, the teacher loved me, and the rest of the kids in the class were actually very witty and intelligent. Nothing could ruin this class for me. But then, things started getting weird. The first incident happened pretty suddenly. Somehow, the topic of Islam came up, and Brian did a complete 180 from the shitty jokes and the unnecessary comments. He went on a rant about how Muslim people were no good psychos who blow up shit, and how they all needed to be eradicated, and a bunch of other insane shit. I was more pissed off than scared, and luckily, the bell rang soon after. I just joked about how idiotic he was for the rest of the day, and the incident was soon at the back of my mind. But that was far from the last time Brian lost it in class. I noticed that Brian had a very explosive temper. He sleeps almost every day in class, which of course is frowned upon. So the first time this happened, the kid behind him woke him up, and Brian flipped his shit. He went absolutely ballistic on the kid behind him, yelling at him, calling him a fag, telling him to suck his dick, yelling at him to go fuck himself, and just in general abusing this poor kid. I've seen some high school boys yell at each other before, of course, but this was so much different. I've never seen someone blow up so easily at such a minor thing before. The more other people in the class began to dislike Brian, the worse he got. One girl in particular, I'll call her Catherine, snaps at him nearly every day. It's the same daily routine. She'll turn around in her seat, insult him, and then turn back to face the front of the class. When she does this, I always have to brace myself to see Brian's face turn into a mask of pure rage and hatred that is truly terrifying to see on somebody so young. Then, after this, he'll begin mumbling things. I've been pretty freaked out by the things that I've heard him mumbling. Over the weeks, he had several more angry outbursts. All of these incidents I could ignore. It wasn't until recently that Brian transformed from a minor annoyance into an actual concern. One day, he was reading a book during class when someone told him to put it down and pay attention. He yelled louder than I've ever heard him yell before.
I am paying attention.
He continued to scream so loudly that the teacher had to finally get him to calm down, and even he looked disturbed. After he finally stopped yelling, Brian just put both hands to his head, closing his eyes, squeezing inward and hissing, "Shut up," over and over again. And I do mean hissing. It sounded so malicious that I had to look away. My concern spiked when we had to do a group assignment. We formed a group of 8 people based on how close together we were in the room, and Brian was in our group. After we finished the assignment, we got off track, talking about where we planned to go after we finished high school. My friend and I, being the only 2 seniors in the group, we were really the only ones who had any sort of idea. My friend shared that she planned to go into the military after graduation, because she had no other way to pay for college. Brian spoke up and said, word for word,
I want to go in the military because I want to know what it's like to kill people.
We were all pretty taken aback by this. If he had said it some other way, we may have laughed it off, but he was dead serious. There was no inflection in his voice. It was just flat, like he was telling us he had a bagel for breakfast or something else mundane like that. I quickly interjected and told him that even if he does go into the military, he's unlikely to ever kill someone. He actually looked pissed at this. Like, really pissed. Needless to say, I've never seen someone look angry at the prospect of not killing people, and I sure as shit don't want to see it again. My friend and I began to joke about how he was likely to become a school shooter one day, and how we hoped he waited until we graduated. But our jokes were an attempt to cover up the genuine concern that we both had. Every time he stood up, or asked to go to the bathroom, or reached into his backpack, we both flinched. Last week, Brian didn't show up for class. We thought he was absent, but word travels fast in high school.